Hey, welcome back, friend. If you're new here, hello. It is so good to have you. And if you have been here before, well, you already know how this works. Get comfortable. Dim the lights a little. Take a breath. Because tonight, we're going somewhere very different. Here is something that will stop you right in your tracks. Imagine waking up in a medieval town somewhere in England around the year 1300. The sun has not yet risen. The streets are dark, a little muddy, and already loud. And almost every single person moving through those streets, setting up stalls, carrying baskets, stoking fires, and running the entire economic heartbeat of the town is a woman. Not a queen, not a noble woman in a tower somewhere. Just ordinary women working. Now, here's the part that might genuinely surprise you. For a long time, we've been told that the working woman is a modern invention, that women entering the workforce was some kind of 20th century breakthrough. But what if that story was wrong? What if women have always been working right there in the open on the streets, at the stalls, in the markets, and history simply forgot to write their names down? Tonight, we're going to fix that. Before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling settles you in, if you find yourself breathing a little slower and leaning in a little closer, would you take just a moment to subscribe to the channel? Maybe hit the like button or share this with someone who would love it, and drop a comment below telling me where you are right now. Are you in bed on the couch? Maybe somewhere on the other side of the world with a cup of tea that has gone a little cold. I genuinely want to know now. Lights low, the world quiet. Let us begin. Sir, close your eyes for just a moment and picture it. A market street in medieval England sometime in the early 1300s. The buildings on either side lean in toward each other, their upper floors almost touching overhead like old friends leaning in to share a secret. The cobblestones are slick with morning dew and things we will not describe in too much detail. The air smells like with smoke, fresh bread, and the distinct atmosphere of a city that has not yet invented modern plumbing. It is maybe 4 o'clock or 5 in the morning. The church bell has not yet rung for the first prayer of the day, and yet the street is already alive. A woman with flour-dusted arms is arranging round loaves on a wooden trestle outside her door. Another is carrying 2 large buckets of fresh milk, her breath making small clouds in the cold morning air. Across the lane, a woman is hanging a simple broom over her doorway, a signal that every single person walking past understands without a word being spoken. She is ill today. Come in. These women are not background figures in someone else's story. They're the story. And historians who have spent years digging through the tax records, court rolls, guild registrations, and property account for places like London, Oxford, York, and Bristol have confirmed what those morning streets already showed. Medieval women worked widely, visibly in an enormous variety of trades. Women appear in those records as brewers, bakers, fishmongers, cloth sellers, candle makers, leather finishers, money lenders, innkeepers, and healers. Rich urban women could operate as merchants in their own right. Some even worked as money lenders. Middle-class women ran businesses in the textile trade and keeping and brewing. And poorer women, the least documented, but the most numerous, sold food and small goods directly in the streets, sometimes without even a stall, just a basket on their arm and their voice to do the selling. 3 very different women, 3 very different circumstances, and yet all 3 of them on the same street. All 3 of them working. Here is a detail that genuinely startled me the first time I read it. A 1363 ordinance from the City of London specified that men were required to keep to one single trade, just one. Women, on the other hand, were permitted to pursue as many trades as they pleased. Let that sit for a second. In 1363, the City of London gave women more occupational flexibility than men. Now, and there's always a catch, is there not that ordinance was not some progressive celebration of female ambition? It was a quiet, unsentimental acknowledgement that women had to piece together multiple low-paying jobs just to survive. One trade was rarely enough. A woman might sell eggs in the morning, spin wool in the afternoon, and surveil by evening, all in the same day, all to keep the household going. But here's what I want you to hold on to. These women did not see themselves as people waiting to be liberated by some future century. They were fully present, fully alive, fully embedded in the economic life of their towns. They just did not make it into the history books the way the knights and the kings did. The market itself is worth pausing on because this is where everything happened. In a medieval English town, The market was not a building. It was not a shopping center or a tidy farmer's market with little chalkboard signs. It was a living, breathing, chaotic outdoor space, the widest street in town or the central square. And it ran, depending on the size of the settlement, anywhere from once a week to every single day. Historical studies of market towns between the 13th and 15th centuries found that in larger cities, daily markets were the norm, while smaller towns typically held markets once or twice a week. Market day was the social event. People came not just to buy and sell, but to hear news, settle disputes, gossip, argue about prices, and see their neighbors. The stalls were wooden boards balanced on barrels or simple trestles. There were no refrigerators, obviously, so everything was sold fresh or sold fast before it stopped being fresh. The noise was extraordinary. Sellers called out their goods at full volume. Animals made their feelings very clear. Carts rumbled over uneven ground. And underneath all of it, the constant low hum of negotiation, women's voices, mostly because women were the ones who ran the daily food stalls. The dairy counters, the small goods tables. This was not passive work. This was not background labor. This was commerce conducted in real time, requiring genuine skill-quick thinking and a very thick skin because it was not always easy to be a woman on that street. Towns across medieval England had inspectors whose job was to check the quality and weight of what was being sold. If your bread was underweight, you were fined. If your ale was suspected of being watered down, you were brought before the court. And surviving records show that women faced these kinds of accusations far more frequently than men, even when the actual offense rates appear to have been roughly equal between the sexes. A 1324 account from Oxford, one of the oldest detailed trade records of its kind, lists the violations of both male and female brewers side by side. The numbers were comparable, but it was the women who ended up in the popular stories. The cheating fishwife, the scheming wife, the woman who put her thumb on the scale. Sound familiar? Sir, now here is something I want you to carry with you through this entire series. There is a real and significant gap between what women actually did in the Middle Ages and what the records say they did, because those records were written by men for men about men. Women appeared most often when something went wrong, when they broke a law, when they were widowed, when they owed a debt. Their ordinary daily competent labor almost entirely invisible. One historian put it this way: when you look at a medieval tax record and see the entry reading John Smith and wife, your eye tend to slide right past the wife. But she was there. She was working. She may well have been running the actual business, managing the accounts, supervising the workers, handling the customers, while John attended the guild meetings and signed the official papers. And when John died, the records would suddenly remember she existed. Oh, one of my favorite details from this entire period, small, but I think it says everything, is that broom hanging over the doorway. When a woman in medieval England was selling ale from her home, she had a universally understood signal. She did not have a sign. She did not have an advertisement. She did not have a logo. She simply hung a broom over her front door, and every person who passed knew exactly what it meant. There is something about that image that moves me every time I come back to it. A woman running a small business out of her own home in a world that gave her almost no legal standing, no official guild membership, no public recognition. And yet she found a way. She hung a broom over her door, and the customers came. That is the spirit of these women, not celebrated, not recorded in the grand histories, but present, resourceful, and stubbornly quietly there. And those women, the ones with the brooms, the ones who brewed the ale, they're the first people we're going to sit with in depth. Because what happened to the alewives of medieval England is one of the most fascinating, infuriating, and strangely familiar stories in all of economic history. They built an entire industry from the ground up. They dominated it for generations. They made it essential to daily life, and then slowly and systematically it was taken from them. How that happened, and why, and what it felt like to be standing on that street when it did. That is exactly where we're going next. So, let's talk about ale. Specifically, let's talk about the fact that for most of the Middle Ages in England, ale was not just a drink. It was water. It was breakfast. It was medicine. It was currency. And it was for a very long time almost entirely made by women. If that surprises you, you are in very good company, because this is one of those corners of history that somehow never made it into the textbooks. even though it is hiding in plain sight in medieval records all across England and Northern Europe. Here is what life looked like in a typical medieval household around the year 1300. You woke up and you did not reach for a glass of water, not because you were too tired, but because water drawn from the wells and rivers of a medieval town was genuinely dangerous. It carried illness. It carried things you could not see and had no name for yet. Ale, on the other hand, was boiled during the brewing process, which killed most of what could harm you. So, you drank ale instead. Your husband drank ale. Your children drank ale. A weaker version, yes, but ale nonetheless. Historians estimate that a typical medieval English family might have consumed something close to a gallon of ale per person per day. A gallon per day per person. And someone had to make all of it. That someone overwhelmingly was a woman. The word for her, and I love that this word exists, was brewster, not brewer. Brewster, the feminine form of the occupation. In the same way that a person who spun thread was a spinner, but a woman who spun thread was a spinster, a man who brewed ale was a brewer, and a woman who brewed ale was a brewster. The word itself tells you everything about how common this was. The English language invented a separate feminine job title because the occupation was so thoroughly, so universally associated with women that it needed its own name, and the brewing process itself was not complicated, which was part of why women could do it from home. You needed malted barley or oats, water, heat, and time. The equipment, large pots, wooden vats, ladles, and straining cloths, was the same equipment already sitting in a medieval kitchen. You did not need a workshop. You did not need expensive tools. You needed what you already had. So, the logic was seamless. A woman brewed ale for her family. She made more than they could drink. She sold the extra to her neighbors. Her neighbors told their neighbors. And suddenly she had a small, steady, unofficial business operating right out of her own home. Hang a broom over the door and the customers come to you. It was, as one researcher described it, the perfect part-time job for a medieval woman. It required no guild membership, no formal training, no male sponsor, and it offered something extraordinarily rare for a woman in this period, a degree of financial independence, modest but real, that almost no other trade could provide. Now, I want to tell you about a place called Brigstock. Brigstock was a small manor in Northamptonshire in central England. Not famous, not dramatic, just a quiet medieval settlement like hundreds of others. But it happens to have some of the most detailed surviving records of medieval women's economic activity anywhere in England. And what those records show is remarkable. In the early 1300s, a group of around 38 women in Brigstock were identified as regular professional alewives, the core of the local brewing trade. These are not wealthy women. Historians who have studied them describe their households as coming from families of modest, ordinary means. They were not running large enterprises. But they were consistent, skilled, and they dominated in Brigstock during this period. The records show almost no meaningful male competition in the ale trade. A handful of men were fined occasionally for brewing violations, but almost all of them were married to women already active in the market, which suggests the men were at best helping their wives, not running independent operations. This was not unusual. Across medieval England, the brewing trade in villages and towns followed this same pattern. Women brewed, women sold, and women kept the whole structure running. And here is something that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. These women were not simply working in the background. They were making real economic decisions. When a nail wife decided to brew a larger batch and sell it to the university halls in Oxford, as some did, she was making a business calculation. When she paid her guild tax independently of her husband, listed separately in the guild records as her own contributor, as the Oxford records show some women doing, she was functioning as a full economic partner, even if the law would not have described her that way. The historian Judith Bennett, who spent years studying this period and wrote the definitive scholarly work on alewives in medieval England, made an observation that has stayed with me. She described it as a dance in which women never lead, meaning women built the industry, held it up, made it work, and then watched it slowly be taken from them. So what happened? How do you lose an industry you essentially invented? The answer is not simple, and it is not one dramatic moment. It is a slow erosion, and it started not with malice, but with economics after the Black Death swept through England between 1347 and 1350. Everything changed. The plague killed roughly a third of the English population. But the survivors, and this is counterintuitive, actually saw their living standards rise in the short term. Fewer people meant more land per person. More land meant better crops. Better crops meant more grain. And more grain meant more ale. The ale market did not shrink after the plague. It grew. And the moment a market grows large enough, capital starts to follow it. By the late 1300s and into the 1400s, wealthier men with access to larger investments, guild connections, and legal standing began to see ale brewing as a serious commercial opportunity. The small home-based, women-run model was giving way to something larger. Professional ale houses replaced doorstep sales. Larger brewing operations replaced kitchen vats. And with scale came the need for capital for equipment, for storage, for transport. Women almost universally did not have access to that kind of capital. Not because they were less capable, but because the law simply did not allow them to borrow, invest, or hold assets the way men could. So as the industry professionalized, it masculinized. By 1600 in London and most major English towns, the brewing trade had flipped almost entirely. The majority of professional brewers were now men. The word brewster began to fade from documents, replaced simply by brewer, a gender-neutral term that erased in its very neutrality 3 centuries of women's dominance in the field. Ask yourself, does this pattern remind you of anything? Because I find it almost impossible to read this history without recognizing it. A field is open, unglamorous, and low status. Women move into it and build it up. It becomes profitable. It becomes prestigious. And then quietly the doors begin to close. But there is something else to this story, something darker and stranger that I have been saving. Because the economic marginalization of the alewife was not just about money and guilds. It was also about reputation. Here is a detail that genuinely unsettles me every time I think about it. As women began to lose ground in the brewing trade, something interesting happened to the way they were portrayed. The friendly neighborhood brewster who kept your village alive with reliable ale. She started appearing in a very different kind of story. Church paintings from the late medieval period began depicting alewives in a very specific way. There are actual surviving images of alewives being dragged to hell by demons in church murals. Not as metaphor, as warning. The alewife, the woman who cheated on her measurements, who watered down the ale, who used her position to lead men astray. She became a stock villain in the popular moral imagery of the age. One church mural, and there are several of these, shows a devil carting away a cartload of alewives who'd been dishonest in their trade. It was meant to be comical. It was also, to anyone running a small brewing business out of their home, a very pointed message about what the community thought of them. The scholar Christine Peters, who has studied the cultural history of this period, noted that the making and selling of ale became increasingly associated with women as deceivers of men, and the stereotype fed on itself. The logic, as one medieval writer put it, ran something like this. The ale trade involved measures that could be shaved, prices that could be inflated, and customers who left drunk and diminished. And were not women, as daughters of Eve, naturally more inclined toward deception. It is one of the more cynical pieces of reasoning I have ever encountered in historical texts. But it worked. The reputation of the alewife soured at almost exactly the same pace as the economic pressure to remove her from the trade. In 1540, and this is one of those facts that makes you set down whatever you are holding, the city of Chester issued an official decree. No woman between the ages of 14 and 40 was permitted to sell ale. The stated reason was that women of this age, being of, quote, sexual desirability, posed a moral risk to the men who came to buy from them 14 to 40, which when you think about it covers almost every woman of working age. It was not the last such ordinance. Similar restrictions appeared in other towns across England through the late 1500s, and each one pushed a few more women further out of the trade they had once owned completely. I want to pause here for a moment, because I think it is worth sitting with what we have just traced. We started with a woman in 13th century Brigstock, ordinary, unrecorded by name, hanging a broom over her door and brewing ale in her kitchen to keep her family and her neighbors alive. She was skilled. She was essential. She was part of a network of women doing the same thing across every village and town in England. 200 years later, her equivalent had been legislated off the street, painted in church murals as a sinner, pushed out of a trade by men who had access to the capital. She was never allowed to accumulate. And the word Brewster, her word, the word that the English language invented specifically for her, quietly disappeared. One more thing before we move on. There's a connection that some historians have drawn carefully and with appropriate caution between the imagery used to describe alewives and the imagery that would later be attached to witches, the pointed hat, the cauldron, the old woman who knows too much about mysterious ingredients and keeps unusual hours. Whether or not the witch figure drew directly from the demonized image of the alewife is still debated by scholars. The overlap in imagery is striking enough that serious academics have spent considerable time examining it. What is not debated is that the tools of the Brewster, the large cauldron, the wide-brimmed hat worn to identify herself at market, the black cat kept to guard the grain from mice map, quite precisely onto what we now think of as the classic image of a witch. I'm not saying every witch trial was about a former alewife. I'm saying when a society decides to criminalize the skills a woman spent her life perfecting, it tends to reach for powerful imagery to make that criminalization feel natural. And the imagery it reached for in this case was already there. What happened to the alewives is one story, but it is not the only story on that medieval market street. Because while the brewers were losing their industry, other women were making different moves entirely. Some of them were spinning silk. Some of them were selling fish. Some of them were quietly building something the history books almost entirely missed. And we're going to find them right after this. Picture this for a moment. You are standing on a medieval market street in London sometime in the mid-300s. The morning light is barely touching the rooftops. And coming toward you, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who has done this 1,000 times, is a woman with a large basket balanced on her arm. She is not wealthy. She does not have a stall with a guild crest above the door. She does not have a certificate, a license, or an official title of any kind. What she has is a basket of eggs, and a sharp eye, and an even sharper tongue when the haggling starts. Her name in the records would have been something like a regratus or a who. And I want to tell you right now, before those words start conjuring up negative images, that these women were the unsung engine of the medieval food supply. Without them, half the city would have gone to bed hungry. The word who has not aged well. Today it sounds like a con artist, a fast talker, someone selling something you probably should not buy. But in medieval England, the word simply meant a woman who sold small goods, usually food, usually from a basket or a portable stall. In fact, the word itself tells you something beautiful about who was doing this work. The original Old English term in use, as early as around 1200, was Hewis. Notice the ending. Not Huck, not Huckman. It came built with the feminine suffix right from the start because the occupation was so thoroughly associated with women that the language did not even bother creating a male form first. The huster bought goods wholesale from farmers, from fishermen, from larger traders, and then sold them individually in smaller quantities to people who needed just enough for a meal or a day or a week. She was the middle layer between the producer and the household. She was the person who made the market accessible to people who could not afford to buy in bulk. In a very real sense, she was running what we would now call a convenience service, the medieval equivalent of the corner store, except the corner store was a woman walking down the street with a basket on her arm, calling out what she had. Now, the other word worth knowing is regret. A regrater was specifically a woman who bought goods, bread, poultry, fish, dairy, and resold them at a small markup. She was a retail seller in a world where the concept of a permanent retail shop was still relatively new and uncommon. And here's something that caught my attention when I first read about this. A document from London dated to 1345, a formal ordinance of the mayor and aldermen, actually regulates the activities of regratresses by name in the same breath as cooks and other legitimate traders. The ordinance covers the sale of poultry at a market hall called Lean Hall. The wording specifies that the best poultry had to be available first in the morning hours for the reputable men of the city. But after a certain hour, after the wealthy merchants had made their selections, the remaining poultry could be sold to, quote, cooks, regratresses, and such other persons as they might please. The regratresses were not an afterthought in this document. They were an expected, recognized, regulated part of the supply chain. The City of London built them into its food distribution system by law. And yet, and this is the part one find quietly maddening, they appear in those same records almost exclusively as problems to be managed. The accusation of forestalling, that is buying goods before they reach the official market in order to resell them at higher prices, hung over these women constantly, as did charges of reg raiding, which confusingly was sometimes used as both a job description and a criminal accusation at the same time. She is a regress. She is reg raiding. What she does for a living is also under the right circumstances an arrestable offense. That kind of double-edged legality was something women in the food trade navigated every single day. Let me tell you about a woman named Sarah Goodwin. She appears in London's Chamberlain's Book of Fines, a ledger of market violations kept from the late 1500s into the early 1600s. Her offenses recorded was buying goods in one market and reselling them in another for profit. Exactly what a regret did. Exactly what hundreds of women before her had done for centuries. She was fined. The fine was small, much smaller than the fines levied on cloth merchants or fishmongers who violated trading rules. The book notes that hewers and street sellers were fined at lower rates because, as the record dryly observes, they were perhaps less able to pay. I love that detail. The city knew these women were working at the margins. It fined them anyway, just enough to remind them of their place. Not enough to put them out of business entirely, because then who would feed the poorer quarters of the city? Sarah Goodwin paid her fine, presumably, and went back to work as she had no choice but to do. Now, the variety of goods these women sold is worth slowing down over, because it is more interesting than you might expect. Yes, eggs. Yes, butter and cheese and milk carried in from the surrounding countryside by women who had sometimes walked several miles before the market even opened. But also fish, which was in a city full of Catholic observance, an enormous and perpetually necessary commodity. The medieval church mandated fasting from meat on Fridays, Saturdays, and the vigils of major saints' days, which when you added them all up could amount to something close to 150 days a year. 150 days when the only acceptable protein was fish, which meant that women selling fish on the street, and there were many of them, had a reliable calendar-driven demand that never went away. The Fishmongers' Guild run by men controlled the large-scale wholesale trade, but the women who carried fish through the streets and sold it piecemeal. The ones hawking salted herring or fresh river fish from baskets balanced on their heads. They served the customers. The guild did not reach. The poor families, the servants, the day laborers who needed one piece of fish for that evening's meal, not a barrel. Records from late medieval Southampton show women selling fish informally on the streets as late as the 1600s, decades after the large-scale trade had been fully consolidated under male guild control. The informal trade persisted because the need it served was real and the guild simply was not meeting it. There is something I want to ask you here, and I genuinely want you to think about it. Have you ever watched a modern farmer's market? Really watch the people running the small stalls, the ones selling jam or pickles or fresh-cut flowers, and thought about the economics of what they are doing the early mornings, the preparation the night before, the cost of the produce versus the price they can charge, the casual conversation that is also always a form of selling. That is almost exactly what the huckster and the ryegratis were doing 700 years ago, with less legal protection, harsher weather, no refrigeration, and the constant background noise of a city that was not particularly interested in their well-being. And yet they showed up every market day, basket in hand, voice ready. Here is something that struck me when I went deeper into the records of this period. The huster was not just selling food. She was performing a kind of social service that the formal market structures simply could not provide. Think about who her customers were. Not the wealthy merchant who sent his servant to buy in bulk at the main stall. Not the guild master who had connections and credit with the larger traders. The hewers' customers were the poor. The people who could not afford to buy a whole side of salt pork. The widow who needed 2 handfuls of oats and nothing more. The apprentice boy who had only a half penny and needed something to eat for dinner. For these people, the huster was not an inconvenience in the market system. She was a market system. She was the only version of commerce that reached them at all. And this is worth sitting with because when medieval town authorities cracked down on hewers, when they issued ordinances restricting where these women could stand, what they could sell, how early they could buy from wholesalers, they were not just regulating nuisances. They were restricting access to food for the poorest urban residents. And the women who absorbed the consequences of that restriction, the ones who were fined and moved on and found another corner of the market they were doing. So not because they loved conflict, but because they had no alternative. You sold or you did not eat. It really was that simple. Now, one thing I want to make clear, because the history sometimes gets flattened here, is that the huckster and the regulatress were not all the same woman. There was in fact a real spectrum. At the bottom, yes, were the women who came from the countryside with whatever surplus their households had produced. A dozen eggs, a small round of cheese, a bundle of dried herbs, and sold it for whatever they could get. These women were the most precarious. They had no permanent spot in the market. They competed for space with everyone else. And if the harvest had been poor, or the cow was sick, or the roads were bad, they simply did not come. But higher up the ladder, and there was a ladder, even if the rungs were slippery, were women who had turned this work into something more deliberate. Women who had regular suppliers. Women who had regular customers who looked for them specifically on market day. Women who had learned to navigate the rules, to pay the necessary fees, to keep on the right side of the right officials. These were small entrepreneurs by any reasonable definition. Not wealthy, not powerful, but skilled, experienced, and consistent. One document from Bureau Market in London, which incidentally traces its origins to a medieval market that grew up at the southern end of London Bridge in the Middle Ages, records authorities specifically cracking down on regradesses who'd been buying bread in one part of the city and reselling it across the bridge for a profit. These women had figured out a price differential between two adjacent markets and were exploiting it. That is not desperate survival behavior. That is market analysis conducted in real time, on foot, without a spreadsheet. And here is the twist that I keep coming back to in 1281. And this is a real document preserved in the memorials of London. The city issued an ordinance about women's clothing in the marketplace. Specifically, it complained that regrats nurses and female servants were dressing too well. They were wearing furred hoods lined with fine skins, which was considered the dress of ladies of good standing. The ordinance restricted them to hoods lined only with lambkin or rabbit skin, plain, modest, appropriate to their station. Now, you can read this in two ways. One reading is that these women were being kept in their place, reminded that no matter how much they earned in the market, they were not to dress above their rank. The other reading, and this is the one I find more interesting, is that enough of these women were earning enough money to dress well that the authorities felt the need to intervene. They were not being fined for poverty. They were being fined for prosperity, for having the audacity to look like they were doing all right. There is something almost funny about that in a very dark way. The city needed these women to feed it, but it drew the line at letting them wear nice fur. The life of a who or a regress was not romantic. I want to be honest about that. It was physically exhausting, legally precarious, and socially low status. These women were at the bottom of every formal hierarchy. They were not in guilds. They were not in the official records unless something went wrong. They were taxed irregularly, moved along by officials accused of forestalling, accused of regretting, accused of being too loud and too present and too persistent in a public space that men like to think of as theirs. But they were there day after day, century after century, in every medieval city across England and Europe. And the food got sold, and the city got fed, and the women came back the next market day with their baskets because the work was not done. What strikes me most thinking about these women, the hewers, the regrets, the fish sellers and egg carriers and cheese traders of the medieval streets, is how invisible the formal record tried to make them, and how completely it failed. They are everywhere once you know how to look. In the fine books, in the ordinances written to control them, in the market regulations that specified indirectly exactly who was there and what they were selling, in the sumpy laws that try to dictate what they wore, in the occasional court record where a named Sarah Goodwin Moore, the fishwife and unnamed woman of Suffolk surfaces, briefly does something the authorities noticed and then disappears back into the crowd. They were not supposed to be remembered, but the evidence of them is everywhere. And if the street level who forgot most completely, the next women we're about to meet were the ones history actively tried to erase. Because while these basket-carrying, market-navigating women were surviving at the edges of the formal economy, there was another group of women operating much closer to the center of it. Women who worked with their hands, produced goods of extraordinary quality and value, and built in at least one remarkable city, a guild structure that men controlled almost nowhere else. The silk workers of medieval Paris were unlike anything else in the medieval world, and their story starts right now. Right at the heart of medieval Paris in the narrow streets running between the Seine in the bustling commercial quarter known as Lille, something was happening that had almost no equivalent anywhere else in medieval Europe. Women were running things not informally, not quietly behind the scenes while men took credit, but officially professionally with guild statutes to back them up and royal tax records to confirm it. These were the silk workers of medieval Paris, and their story is genuinely one of the most unexpected and underappreciated chapters in the entire history of women and work. To understand why Paris was different, you first have to understand what silk meant in the medieval world. Silk was not fabric, or rather, it was not merely fabric. It was a statement of power, a declaration of status, a material so precious, so associated with wealth and refinement that its production and trade formed one of the most lucrative industries in the entire medieval economy. The raw silk itself traveled extraordinary distances before it ever touched a needle or a loom. Silkworms were cultivated in Central Asia, in China, in the Mediterranean basin. The raw cocoons were processed, the fibers extracted, the thread wound, and shipped overland by sea through networks of merchants and traders that spanned continents. By the time raw silk arrived in Paris, it had already passed through dozens of hands across thousands of miles. And what happened to it in Paris was for more than a century something that happened nowhere else north of the Mediterranean. For roughly the 100 red years between the late 1200s and the late 1300s, Paris was the only city in all of Northern Europe producing luxury silk cloth. Not a major city, not one of several, the only one. Every count and countess in France who wanted fine silk needed to come through Paris. The English royal court bought Parisian silk. The courts of Artois, Savoy, Flanders, Holland, Sweden, and Navarre all had accounts with Parisian silk merchants. The historian Sharon Farmer, who spent years reconstructing this industry from tax rolls and guild records and aristocratic account books, found evidence of Parisian silk appearing in royal and noble households across a huge swathe of medieval Europe. Medieval Paris was even then a fashion capital, and the people making that fashion in large part were women. Here is the number that stopped me cold when I first encountered it. At the end of the 13th century, Paris may have had as many as 900 women working specifically as silk thrusters, that is, workers who took the raw silk thread and twisted it into the usable yarn that the weavers and embroiderers needed. 900 women in one city, in one industry, just in that one step of the production process. When you add in the silk combers, the gold thread spinners, the ribbon and lace makers, the veil weavers, the other workers involved at every stage of the process, historians estimate there may have been as many as 1,400 women working in Paris's silk trade around this period. That is not a cottage industry. That is a major urban workforce, and the vast majority of it was female. Now, the natural question is why Paris? Why did this particular city, in this particular era, produce something so unlike anything around it? An industry where women not only worked in large numbers, but rose to positions of genuine authority. The answer, when you dig into it, is a fascinating combination of timing, geography, law, and accident. The men who brought silk production technology to Paris were Italian immigrants, merchants and craftsmen from the northern Italian cities who had their own silk industries back home. They arrived in Paris in the late 13th century during a period when the French king was encouraging skilled artisans to settle in the city, and they brought their knowledge with them. But here's the thing about those Italian cities where these men came from, in places like Florence and Lucca. Silk production had been running for decades, and it had developed in a particular direction, heavily male, heavily guild controlled, with women almost always confined to the lowest and least paid positions. A woman in the Italian silk trade was a spindle carrier, a bundle holder, someone who did the most basic labor under the direction of men. When those same Italian merchants arrived in Paris and began setting up their workshops, they brought their technical skills, but they did not bring their entire labor structure with them. They're in a new city building something from scratch, and Paris, as it turned out, had its own ideas about how this was going to work. The Parisian guild system, as it was codified in the late 1260s under the city's royal prost, in some respects less rigid than its Italian equivalent. It left more room, and into that room stepped women. Let me tell you what it actually looked like inside the Paris silk trade. The industry was organized into a series of distinct stages, each one essential, and each one associated with particular workers and particular guilds. The first stage was the thrusters. These were the women, overwhelmingly women, who took the raw silk fiber and twisted it on spindles into the thread that the weavers needed. The work was skilled. It required a practiced hand and a trained eye to produce thread of consistent quality. Too loose, and the weave would be uneven. Too tight, and the thread would break. A good thruster knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew it from years of practice, often learned in the workshop of a mistress who had herself learned from her own mistress before her. The Guild for the Silk Thrusters is a remarkable document. It specifically names prudes filles, the French term for honored or respected women, as overseers alongside men. Not just workers, not just members. Overseers, women who held genuine supervisory authority over the standards and practices of the guild. This was not common. In most medieval guilds across Europe, the idea of a woman serving in an official oversight role was somewhere between unlikely and unthinkable. In the Parisian Silk Thrusters Guild, it was written into the rules. Then there were the veil weavers. And this is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Among the multiple silk trades operating in Paris in this period, there was at least one guild, the guild that produced silk veils that was, as far as historians can tell, entirely female. Not predominantly female, not female in practice, while technically open to men. Female in its official structure, female in its leadership, female in its membership, an all-female guild in medieval Europe. Let that register for a moment. In a world where the guild system was one of the most powerful economic and social institutions in urban life, where guild membership determined your income, your legal standing, your professional identity, there existed in Paris a guild that belonged entirely to women. The veils they produced were not trivial goods. Silk veils were worn by the nobility. They appeared in the wardrobes of queens. They were luxury items with a steady high status market, and the women who made them were organized, structured, officially recognized, and answerable to no male authority within the terms of their own guild. I want to pause and ask you something, because I find this genuinely fascinating to think about. We tend to assume that the further back you go in history, the worse things were for women. That the story of women's progress is a straight line forward from constraint toward freedom, from the margins toward the center. But what the Parisian silk industry shows is that history is not a straight line. It bends. It doubles back. It produces pockets of possibility in the most unexpected places. Here were women in the late 1200s and early 1300s in a world without voting rights, without legal independence from their husbands, without almost any of the formal protections we would consider basic today, who were running workshops, supervising apprentices, sitting on guild oversight committees, selling luxury goods to royal courts across Europe, and building businesses significant enough to appear on official Parisian tax rolls. Balls. Not all of them, of course, not even most of them. The majority of silk workers were modest earners doing skilled but repetitive work for wages that were decent by women's standards, but still lower than what their male counterparts in the same industry earned. But some of them climbed very high. The tax assessments from Paris between 1292 and 13,137 separate assessments, taken over about 2 decades, are one of the most remarkable documents in the history of medieval women's work. They are dry, bureaucratic, entirely unglamorous, and they are full of women. Of the 241 women listed on those tax rolls with their profession identified, roughly 26% were working in silk. 1 in 4 of the professionally identified women in Paris at the turn of the 14th century was a silk worker. And among those women, the range of economic standing was striking. Some were small-scale spinners doing piecework for minimal pay, but some a notable and documented minority were mistresses of their own lease. Women who employed workers, women who managed production, women who dealt directly with the great mercers who supplied the raw materials and sold the finished goods. And a few, as the historian Farmer carefully documents, went even further. A few ended up doing direct business not just with merchants, but with aristocrats, with the nobility of France and neighboring territories, in some cases with the king's household itself. Women negotiating orders for luxury silk goods with the courts of medieval Europe. I keep coming back to that image. I find something quietly astonishing about it. Not because women were incapable of it. Clearly they were not. But because the world they were operating in gave them so little reason to expect it was possible, and they did it anyway. The contrast with the Italian cities these craftsmen came from is worth dwelling on. When the Italian silk workers arrived in Paris, They came from a system where women in the silk trade were firmly at the bottom. Floor-level workers invisible in the guild records present in the workshops, but absent from the ledgers. In Paris, something different happened. The industry was new. The guild structures were being built from the ground up. And in that window of formation, before the rules hardened, before the boundaries were clearly drawn, women moved into positions that the Italian system would never have allowed. This is a pattern that appears in economic history with enough regularity that it has its own quiet logic. New industries, before they develop established hierarchies, tend to be more open. The spaces where power has not yet fully settled are the spaces where outsiders, women, immigrants, people without the right connections sometimes find their way in. The Parisian silk trade was exactly the kind of space for about 100 years, and then, as it always seems to the window, began to close. By the 15th century, the silk cloth industry in Paris was in decline, disrupted by shifting trade routes, political instability, and competition from the growing Italian manufacturing centers. By some point before the year 1467, the luxury silk cloth industry in Paris had effectively disappeared. The all-female veil weavers guild, the 900 thrusters with their spindles, the mistresses of atelier who sold to royal courts gone. Not because women failed, not because the work was inferior, but because the external conditions that had made their particular space possible had shifted. And when the industry reorganized itself, women were not invited to the table where the new structure was being designed. There is a detail from the silk trade research that I find almost unbearably human, and I want to share it before we move on. Among the guild statutes for the silk thrusters, there is a passage that deals with a specific problem the guild was trying to address. Some of the spinners, it turns out, were stealing from the raw silk they were given to process. Not large quantities, small amounts of thread taken from the bundles they were supposed to be working with. Why? Because they were poor. Because the raw silk could be pawned to the Jewish money lenders in the neighborhood for small amounts of cash. Cash that could buy food, or pay rent, or cover the 1,000 small disasters of a precarious life. The guild record notes this practice and tries to regulate against it. But what it really reveals is the full complexity of what we're looking at. These were not just workers in a romanticized guild structure. These were women navigating genuine financial hardship, using the materials that passed through their hands as a kind of emergency resource. The same hands that produced silk fine enough to clothe queens were also sometimes quietly redirecting a few threads to survive the week. That detail, for me, makes the whole story more real. Not a triumph of female industry, tidily packaged, but real life, complicated, constrained, occasionally resourceful in ways the guild did not sanction. Real women doing what they had to do. And speaking of women doing what they had to do, there is one particular legal arrangement unique to medieval England that gave certain women a kind of power that almost nothing else in the legal system allowed. It was called the femme sole, and it changed everything for the women who knew how to use it. That is where we are headed next. Of all the ideas we've touched on so far in this series, the broom over the doorway, the basket of eggs in the cold morning air, the silk spindles turning in a Parisian workshop, there's one concept from medieval law that I keep returning to because it is quietly one of the most radical legal ideas in the entire history of women and work. It was called the femme sole, 2 words in Old Norman. French, literally a woman alone, and the story of what those 2 words meant, what they could give a woman, what they could not protect her from, and the strange particular way the law both offered freedom and quietly took it back, is something I think you're going to find genuinely surprising. To understand why the femme mattered, you first have to understand what it was escaping from. In medieval England, the default legal condition of a married woman was called cover. Under cover, a woman who married did not simply change her name or her address. She changed her legal existence. She ceased in the eyes of the law to exist as a separate person at all. There is a formulation from medieval legal writing that sums it up with stunning bluntness. It goes something like this. By marriage, husband and wife become one person in law, and that person is the husband. What this meant in practice was that a married woman could not own property. She could not sign a contract. She could not take a debtor to court. She could not be taken to court herself. Her husband would answer for her. Any business she built, any goods she sold, any money she earned belonged legally to him. She was in the beautiful but chilling language of the age covert de baron, covered by her lord. Now, you might be thinking, how on earth did any of these women we've been talking about, the wives, the regretresses, the silk workers, how did any of them function as actual business women inside a legal system that technically denied them the right to do so? The answer is many of them simply did, and the law looked the other way. And for a specific group of women in a specific city, the law went one step further and actually codified a way out. The city was London, and the escape hatch was the femme sole. The earliest written record of the femme sole status in London comes from a municipal customs document, a legal guide to how the city did things written under the Lord Mayor Henry Darcy in the 1330s. But the practice itself appears to be older than that, possibly stretching back to the 13th century. The principle was straightforward, if remarkable. A married woman who traded independently of her husband, meaning she ran her own business, kept her own accounts, dealt with her own customers, could register with the city authorities as a femme sole. By doing so, she stepped outside the protective shadow of her husband's legal identity. She could now trade goods. She could own property in her own name. She could sell land, bequeath assets, and take civil suits all the way to court and be taken to court in return. In return for this legal personhood, she also accepted something her husband would otherwise have covered, full personal liability for her own debts. If her business failed, the consequences were hers alone. She could not shelter behind her husband's identity to escape creditors. If she could not pay, she could be sent to prison. Her husband's goods would not be touched. So let us sit with that for a moment. The femme sole was in effect a legal bargain. Freedom and accountability bundled together. You want to be treated as a person, then be treated as a person all the way through, including when things go wrong. Now, I want to be honest with you here because the history of the femme sole is one of those corners of the past where enthusiasm can outrun the evidence. And I think the real story is more interesting than the simplified version. Anyway, for a long time, historians celebrated the femme sole as proof of a golden age of women's economic independence in medieval London. The argument ran here is this extraordinary legal tool that let married women operate as full economic agents in one of the busiest commercial cities in Europe. What a remarkable thing. And it was remarkable. But more recent scholarship has complicated the picture significantly. Because here is the thing, very few women actually registered as femme soles. The records of women officially claiming this status are surprisingly sparse. And historians who have spent years looking for concrete examples of married women using the femme sole mechanism to sue debtors in court or to formally register businesses in their own names have found far fewer cases than the celebration of the concept might lead you to expect. Why? The answer, when you think about it, has a certain dark logic. Coverture. The very system the femme was supposed to escape was in some circumstances actually useful. Stay with me here. A merchant who wanted to do business with a married woman faced a choice. If she was legally a femme sole, she was entirely responsible for her own debts. He could sue her if she did not pay. But if she was a femme covet covered by her husband, the merchant had to be very careful. Because if she entered into a contract without her husband's explicit permission, the contract might not be enforceable. Which meant from the woman's point of view that debt she incurred, while technically undercover, might simply vanish. Her husband was not liable for unauthorized debt she ran up in a trade he had not sanctioned, and she herself was technically not a legal person. So who exactly was going to collect? Some historians have observed that cover could function in practice as what one scholar called the ultimate legal dodge. It was a shield as much as a cage. A woman who stayed within it might find paradoxically that creditors were less willing to pursue her aggressively because the legal grounds for doing so were muddier. The femme sole was powerful, but power came with exposure, and not every woman decided the exposure was worth it. That said, some women absolutely did, and the ones who did have left us some of the most fascinating individual portraits in all of medieval economic history. Let me tell you about a woman named Agnes Pafford. Agnes lived in Southampton, a busy port city on the southern coast of England at some point in the later medieval period. She was a merchant, not a street seller, not a small-scale trader, a merchant in the full sense, someone who dealt in goods at substantial volume across long distances with foreign partners. Agnes Pafford traded with Brittany on a large scale. Think about what that means for a moment. This is international commerce. Goods crossing the English Channel, negotiations with French merchants, credit arrangements, shipping arrangements, the whole complex infrastructure of longue distance medieval trade. And Agnes Pathford was doing it. A woman in a world where the legal system said she did not formally exist without her husband's authorization. We do not have her letters. We do not have her account books. What we have is her name and other people's records, appearing with enough regularity and in enough context to tell us that she was real, she was active, and she was operating at a level that most people of her era, men included, never reached. She was not alone. The records from medieval England, when you know where to look, are dotted with women operating at impressive levels of commerce. Women who made it into the historical sources not because they left diaries or wrote memoirs, but because they traded in volumes large enough to appear in customs accounts, because they lent money in sums large enough to generate lawsuits, because they ran businesses significant enough that someone thought it worth noting. A 1274 census roll from Wales, for instance, lists wool merchants. And among the greatest wool merchants in England at that time, according to the document, were widows from London. Not a widow here or there, the greatest. Marjorie Russell of Coventry was one of the most prominent cloth merchants of her era. Rose de Burford, a London merchant's wife who became a merchant in her own right, was known widely enough that her name has survived 7 centuries. Elizabeth de Morsford, women who dealt in the stuff that made the English medieval economy move wool cloth, the raw materials of the most important industry the country had. And a study of female merchants in England between the mid-1200s and the early 1500s found that while women made up only around 3 to 4% of merchants in the formal records, some of those women were playing in the highest tier of commercial life their era had to offer. 3 to 4% sounds small, but when you remember that the formal records were almost entirely designed to record men, that women appeared in them as an exception rather than a rule, that number starts to look like the edge of something much larger, that the document simply could not see. Can I ask you something? Do you think it is possible to fully trust a historical record that was not designed to include you? I think about this a lot. When we look at medieval economic history and see mostly men, we tend to assume that is because mostly men were doing the work. But there is another explanation. The record keepers were men. The guild secretaries were men. The notaries who drew up contracts were men. The court clerks were men. And men writing about commerce in the Middle Ages had very little reason to carefully document the economic activities of women, unless those women were doing something unusual enough to cause a legal dispute, or were widows with enough assets to generate a will, or were somehow so significant that ignoring them entirely would have made the record inaccurate. The women we can see are almost certainly the tip of something much larger. Which brings me to one of the most telling documents I came across while thinking about this series. It is from London in the year 1455. A group of skilled women working in the silk trade, not in Paris this time, but in London, submitted a formal petition to Parliament, not to their husbands, not to their guild masters, to Parliament. They were petitioning for protection against foreign competition. Specifically, they were worried about Italian silk goods being imported into England at prices that undercut their own work, and they asked Parliament to restrict those imports. These women had no official guild. They had no formal legal standing as a corporate body. What they had was the confidence, the collective sense of their own legitimacy to walk up to the most powerful legislative body in England and say, "Our industry matters. Our work matters, and we need you to protect it." Parliament listened. The petition had a real, though limited, effect. I find something deeply moving about that image. Women who could not vote, could not hold public office, could not even own property, without navigating elaborate legal fictions, standing up and saying formally to the men who ran the country, "We are here. We are workers, and we have rights worth protecting." That is not a background story. That is history. Now, there is one more dimension of the femme soul story that I think deserves attention because it connects to everything we have been talking about, and it will lead us directly into the next part of this journey. The femme soul as a legal status worked best in a particular kind of environment. It worked best in cities, in places with developed commercial courts, in places where the custom of the local jurisdiction could override the rigidities of the common law. London had that. Some other English towns had it, but it was not universal. And even where it existed It was fragile because the femme sole relied on a woman's ability to operate independently of her husband, which meant if her husband died, everything could change, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. The death of a husband in the medieval world was a legal watershed for a woman. It could strip everything away, or it could open a door that nothing else could. And the women who walked through that particular door, the widows who inherited not just grief, but suddenly unexpectedly legal existence, are some of the most remarkable figures in this entire story. The widow's advantage and what it meant to live it from the inside. That is exactly where we're going next. There is a moment, and I have thought about this more than I probably should, when a woman in medieval England became a different kind of person under the law. Not gradually, not through years of effort or petition or advocacy, but in a single instant, the moment her husband died. Before that moment, she was legally invisible. After it, she was suddenly fully legally real. She could own property. She could sign contracts. She could sue a debtor in her own name. She could be sued. She could write a will and decide what happened to everything she had worked to accumulate. She could train apprentices, open a shop, negotiate with merchants, and do business with the city courts without a male guardian standing beside her to make the transaction official. All of it required only one thing. Her husband had to be gone first. I do not know whether to call that ironic or simply heartbreaking, but it is one of the most vivid illustrations of what the medieval legal system actually valued in a woman, her absence from the category of wife. Once you were no longer a wife, the law was in certain remarkable ways almost generous. Widowhood in medieval England was not one experience. It was a spectrum. On one end, the poor widow of a laborer who died with nothing, leaving her to figure out how to feed her children on whatever she could earn day by day. She had the same legal freedom as any other widow. But legal freedom without assets is an abstract kind of luxury. On the other end, the widow of a wealthy merchant or master craftsman who'd spent years working alongside her husband, learning the trade, managing the accounts, knowing the suppliers and the customers and the rhythms of the business, as well as he did sometimes better, and who, when he died, simply kept going. And it was this second kind of widow who showed up in the medieval records in ways that genuinely astonished me. Under English common law, a widow was entitled to a third of her late husband's property. This was called the dare. It was her legal minimum, the floor, not the ceiling. What she actually received often depended on what her husband had arranged, what his family accepted, and how skilled she was at navigating what could be, and frequently was a difficult legal process. But for guild members, wives, for the women who had worked in workshops alongside craftsmen and merchants and tradespeople for years, sometimes decades, widowhood carried something potentially more valuable than the dare. It carried access. The typical medieval guild in England and across much of Northern Europe allowed a widow to continue her deceased husband's trade, not as a full member with voting rights, not with the authority to train new apprentices independently in all cases, but as a recognized practitioner allowed to keep the workshop open, maintain the customer relationships, and operate the business that she had in many cases been running half of. Anyway, think about the practical reality of that. A woman who had spent 15 years as a weaver's wife had watched thousands of yards of cloth come off the loom. She knew which dyes were best. She knew which suppliers could be trusted and which ones needed watching. She knew what customers expected and how to handle complaints. She knew the rhythm of the work, the seasonal patterns of demand, the names of the apprentices, and what each of them was capable of. And then her husband died, and the guild said, "You may continue." It was not a gift. It was, in a very real sense, a recognition of something that had always been true. What I find fascinating, and also the more I sit with it a little infuriating, is the specific condition that came attached to this widow's privilege in almost every guild I have read about. She could continue as long as she did not remarry outside the guild the moment she took a new husband who was not already a member of the same trade or guild. Access expired immediately. She lost the workshop, the membership, the standing, everything. So the system that appeared to offer women a door was also quietly attached to a leash. Stay single, or stay within the guild family. Remarry outside and the door closes. You can decide for yourself whether that was a reasonable regulation for maintaining guild quality standards, or whether it was something else entirely. I have my own view, but I want to let the history speak first. Now I want to tell you about a woman whose story I find completely extraordinary. Her name was Annabel Ferner, and she lived in London in the 1430s. She was the widow of a grocer. And before you picture a woman in a small shop with wheels of cheese and jars of pickles, I need to tell you what grocer meant in medieval London. A medieval grocer was not a shopkeeper. A medieval grocer was a wholesale merchant. Someone who traded in bulk commodities, spices, dried fruits, dyes, luxury goods imported from across Europe and the Mediterranean and distributed throughout England. The Worshipful Company of Grocers, which was the guild that controlled this trade, was ranked second among the great 12 livery companies of London, the absolute commercial elite of the city. Annabel Furner's husband, John, had been one of these men. When he died, Annabel did not retreat. She did not sit quietly in her house, waiting for someone to tell her what came next. She walked into an Italian merchant bank on Lombard Street and started buying. The bank was Filippo Boron and Company. It was one of the major international banking and trading houses operating in London at the time, with connections to merchant networks across Europe, and the records of that bank, preserved in Italian archives for 600 years, and only recently made fully accessible to researchers through a collaborative project, contain the name Annabel Furner. In July of 1437, the Boron Bank records show a transaction with Annabel. She bought saffron, not a small quantity. The record specifies the gross weight. The allowance for packaging, the net weight 54.12, carefully calculated at 14 shillings per pound. The total 386 shillings. If that number does not mean anything to you, here is some context. A skilled craftsman in the England of the 1430s earned approximately 5 to 6 a year. Annabel Furner's single saffron transaction was worth approximately 6 to 8 years of that craftsman's wages in one purchase from one bank in 1 month. And it was not the only transaction. The records show her buying cotton in comparable quantities, conducting business with the sophistication, the careful documentation of weights, the credit arrangements with settlement dates that characterize the most serious international traders of the era. She was also fined by the grocer company for not paying toward the annual company feast, which, once you understand it, is actually a rather wonderful detail, because you do not get fined by the grocer company for missing their feast unless you are considered a member of the grocer's company. Annabel was being treated and was treating herself as a full participant in one of the most powerful commercial organizations in England. She was not the only one. The scholarly collection called Medieval London Widows, which documents the lives of women who ran businesses in London between roughly 1300 and 1500, is full of women like Annabel. Women who inherited not just property, but commercial standing credit relationships, supplier networks, and the accumulated goodwill of businesses their husbands had spent careers building. Joan Buckland, documented in the mid-400s, inherited her husband's connections and used them to conduct business at a level that had her appearing in multiple records of significant commercial transactions. Several widows from the wool trade in London appear in a Welsh census document from 1274 listed simply as among the greatest wool merchants in England at that time. Not the greatest female wool merchants, the greatest. In the records of London's livery companies, the guild-like organizations that controlled different trades in the city, show widows in a remarkable variety of fields. Widows of fishmongers, widows of goldsmiths, widows of mercers, haberdashers, pewter. In trade after trade, there are women who stepped into the visible role when their husbands died and simply kept the work moving. Can I share something I find genuinely thought-provoking here? There's an argument that some historians have made, and it is a careful argument, not a simple one, that widows in medieval commerce were not exceptional. They were the visible portion of something that had been operating all along. Think about it this way. A merchant's wife who spent years managing the household accounts, receiving suppliers at the door, supervising apprentices, handling correspondence. When her husband traveled, negotiating with customers, in his absence, this woman had built up decades of practical commercial knowledge. The business was not his alone. It was theirs. The records just did not say so. When he died, and she stepped forward under her own name, the records suddenly noticed her. But she had not changed. The work had not changed. Only the legal visibility had changed. The widow in this reading is not a special category of capable woman. She is every working woman in commerce finally allowed to be counted. But I want to be honest about the limits of the widow's world too, because this is a story that can be romanticized too easily. The legal freedom of widowhood was real. But it came with vulnerabilities that were also very real. A widow was by definition a woman without a male protector in a world that used male protectors as a structural assumption at every level. She was vulnerable to pressure from her late husband's family, who might dispute the inheritance. She was vulnerable to feudal lords who in the higher ranks of society claimed the right to approve or arrange her remarriage. She was vulnerable to creditors who held her husband's debts. She was vulnerable to the simple arithmetic of running a household on the proceeds of a business in a world with no social safety net and volatile markets. A study of Tanner's wills in early 14th century London found that most widows were left property that could generate income, rental income, or income from small-scale trading, but that it was actually quite rare for widows to be given the business itself. The more common pattern was the business going to the sons with the widow, receiving assets that could support her, but not necessarily lead her. And the guild privilege of continuing the trade was not always as straightforward as it sounds. In many cases, a widow could continue the work only until male children reached an appropriate age to take over. Her continuity was provisional. Her authority was temporary. She was in those cases a caretaker, not an inheritor. This tension between the genuine and significant freedoms that widowhood could provide and the ways those freedoms were constrained, contingent, and time-limited is to me the most honest way to understand the medieval widow's position. She was not simply oppressed. She was not simply liberated. She was operating in a system that offered her certain possibilities with one hand while holding on to the terms with the other. And what impresses me reading about these women is not the freedom they had. It is what they chose to do with the limited, complicated, sometimes grudgingly extended freedom they were given. Annabel Ferner walked into a bank and bought 54 pounds of saffron. The wool merchants' widows kept the trade routes moving. Joan Buckland ran her business and kept her name in the records. They did not wait to be celebrated. They worked. And while the widows were navigating the complicated terrain of guild membership and inheritance law, there was another group of women entirely who were dealing with a different kind of wall. Not the wall of cover, not the wall of inheritance, but the wall built specifically and deliberately inside the guild system. The place where medieval working women were most directly, most systematically, and most creatively excluded. The guild walls and what women did about them. That is exactly where we're going next. Let me tell you about a law. A real law from a real medieval guild in a real city. A female dyer working in medieval Europe was not permitted to lift cloth from the dyeing vats. That is it. That is the law. She could dye. She could prepare the dyes. She could manage the timing and the temperature and the color and all of the actual skilled work of the trade. But she could not lift the cloth out when it was done. A female pastry maker in another guild in another city was permitted to carry her goods through the streets to sell them. But she was allowed only one box at a time. One. Not two boxes, one in each hand, not a cart or a tray, or a basket over her arm. One box of biscuits per trip maximum. I have read a lot of medieval history, and these two laws are somehow both genuinely funny and genuinely infuriating at the same time, because they are not accidental. They are not careless. They are the product of deliberate, specific, thoughtful effort by people who sat in a room together and decided that these exact, precise, bizarrely targeted restrictions were necessary to put in writing. Which means someone somewhere looked at a woman who was lifting cloth out of the dyeing vat and said, "No, not that." And someone else looked at a woman who was carrying 2 boxes of biscuits through the street and said, "Put one down." And I have to ask, what exactly were they afraid of? The medieval guild system was in many ways the most powerful economic institution in urban life. If you wanted to sell bread in a city, you needed the baker's guild to recognize you. If you wanted to make shoes, you needed the cordwainers. If you wanted to work in any craft trade at a significant level, the guild either gave you permission or it did not. And if it did not, you were working outside the law. Guilds set the prices. Guilds set the standards. Guilds controlled who could be trained, who could take apprentices, and who could call themselves a master of the craft. They were economic organizations, professional associations, social clubs, and political lobbying bodies all rolled into one. By the 13th century, virtually every significant craft and trade in a major European city had its own guild. And by the late medieval period, those guilds were the economic backbone of urban civilization. So when women were excluded from guilds or admitted on deliberately constrained terms, the consequences were not abstract. They were concrete, financial, permanent. The structure of the guild system, in its standard form, went something like this. A young person was apprenticed to a master, typically for 7 years, living and working at the master's household, learning the craft from the ground up. After the apprenticeship, they became a journeyman working for wages. And eventually, if they had the skill and the means and the connections, they could produce a masterwork, a piece of craft that demonstrated their expertise and applied to become a master themselves. Masters ran their own workshops. Masters trained the next generation. Masters set the quality standards. Masters voted on guild policy. Masters were the guild. Now ask yourself, how many women do you think made it through that pipeline? The honest answer is a very small number. Not zero, but very small. London court records from the medieval period show roughly 40 cases involving female apprentices. Male apprentices in the same records, over 200 in a register of free men from 1309 to 1312 people who gained the full right to sell goods in London through completing an apprenticeship, list 253 names. 0 of them were women. That is not oversight. That is a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. But here's where it gets complicated, as it always does when we talk about medieval women in work. Because the guild system was not the only system, and not everything was a guild trade. Research into women's work in medieval southern France and Toulouse, Melier, Merlis, and other cities of Languedoc and Provence has found women working in a remarkable variety of occupations, many of them entirely outside the formal guild structure, and many of them quite surprising. In Marseilles in the early 1340s, a female baker named Jeannette Barral obtained a contract with the Royal Navy. She promised to supply 2,000 quintals of sea biscuits within 8 weeks. That is an enormous quantity of baked goods delivered to a military client under a formal contract by a woman operating a professional bakery in medieval France. Not a small informal household operation, a real commercial enterprise. In Montpellier in the 1340s, a girl named Gilma was placed in a 4-year apprenticeship to learn the art of painting. Her teacher was Alizatia, the widow of a plowman who is described in the records as a Ptora, a female painter. A widow of a plowman, not a guild painter, not the wife of an artist, running her own painting practice and taking on apprentices. In Alice around 1425, a female called her maker is documented in tax records as overseeing a family workshop employing her daughter, her son-in-law, her niece, and her nephew, a woman running a metalwork business with a family staff. And in Montpellier, a 15th century tax record lists a woman designated as a ferreta, a female blacksmith. A female blacksmith. I want to pause on that for a second, because we so rarely think of women in the medieval period in connection with metalwork. And yet there she is in the tax records paying her taxes apparently as a blacksmith. What these examples suggest, and there are many more like them scattered across the records of southern France and elsewhere in Europe, is that the guild wall, while real and significant, was not the whole picture. Beside it and around it, and sometimes straight through it, women were working. The key was often not the guild itself, but the specific local customs of a particular city. In Melier, up to 15 trades were explicitly open to women under the city statutes. In Toulouse 5 and Aix-en-Provence, the guild statutes mostly said nothing about women at all, which, as any lawyer will tell you, is a form of ambiguity that people in need of work will find a way to exploit. Silence in the law is not always prohibition. Sometimes it is just silence, and silence for a woman who needed to feed her household was something she could work with. Here's a question I genuinely want you to think about for a moment. If you were a skilled medieval woman, a competent baker, a dyer who knew every combination of herbs and minerals to produce every color, a customer could want a painter who had trained for years, and the guild told you that you could practice your craft, but only within specific, carefully designed limits. That guaranteed you could never fully compete with the men in your trade. What would you do? Would you comply? Would you find a workaround? Would you leave the city for somewhere the rules were written differently? Would you work in the informal market below the radar of the guild inspectors? Because medieval women did all of these things, and the records, when they exist, show them being remarkably creative about it. Consider the city of Cologne. Cologne in medieval Germany was one of the most interesting places in Europe for the question of women and guilds. Because Cologne had something almost nowhere else did, 3 guilds composed almost entirely of women. The yarn spinners, the gold spinners, the silk weavers. Men could technically join these guilds, but the records show almost no men actually doing so, and when they did, they were essentially always the husbands of women already in the guild. The practical operation of these trades was female. The oversight was female. The economic identity of the work was female. In Cologne, women were also present, though in more limited ways, in the leather trades, the dyers, and the cotton weaving guilds. The overall picture of Cologne is of a city where women had negotiated over time genuine spaces of occupational authority in ways that were unusual, even by the standards of medieval Europe. Why Cologne? Historians have offered various answers. One is simply that the city's guild structure developed in a way that left certain niches less contested by men and women, moved into them early, and held on. Another is related to the specific textile trades which had long been associated with women's work, and which in Cologne never fully transitioned to male control the way they did in many English towns. Whatever the reason, the contrast with London is striking. In London, the silk women had all the practical skills, all the customer relationships, all the expertise, and no guild of their own. In Cologne, the silk weavers had a guild, and it was theirs. In Rouen, in northern France, something equally remarkable happened. Women had participated as full guild masters, not as wives, not as widows, not as adjuncts, but as actual full-status masters in 7 of the city's 112 guilds since at least the 13th century. 7 guilds, full master status in the city of Rouen for centuries. One of the things I find most striking about that is how unremarkable it apparently seemed at the time. There is no evidence of crisis or controversy around the women masters of Rouen, no pamphlets denouncing them, no emergency regulations written to limit their power. They were simply there doing their work, running their workshops, sitting in their guild meetings, and the city functioned. Which means when someone argues that women could not have run guilds or achieved master status in the Middle Ages, that it was simply too far outside the acceptable social order. The answer from Rouen is it was done for hundreds of years right there. There's another thing about the guild system and women that deserves attention because it rarely gets it. The guilds were not just economic organizations. They were also moral communities. They had patron saints. They held religious ceremonies. They provided charity for the families of members who fell into hardship. They were in some respects the closest thing many urban workers had to a community support structure. And when women were excluded from full guild membership, they were not just excluded from the economic benefits. They were excluded from this community, from the social standing, from the collective identity that said, I belong to this trade, and this trade will take care of me. Think about what that meant in practice. A woman who ran a successful dyeing business for 30 years, who knew the trade, as well as any man in the city, who kept her own apprentices and supplied her own customers. If she was not a guild member, she had no voice at the meetings where the rules of her own trade were written. She could not vote on the standards she was required to meet. She could not sit on the jury that decided whether her work was up to quality. She was subject to the decisions of a body she was not allowed to join. Men wrote the laws she had to follow. Men enforced them. Men decided when she had violated them. And she had almost no formal mechanism for challenging any of it. And yet, a female blacksmith in Montellier, a pastry maker in Paris, carrying her one permitted box, presumably calculating exactly how many trips she could make in a day. A painter in a widow's household, teaching young girls the art. 3 guilds in Cologne that belonged to women. 7 guilds in Rouen where women held master status. A naval contract in Marseille signed by a woman baker. The guild wall was real. The restriction was real. The exclusion was real. But so was the work on the other side of it. And what I keep coming back to the more I read about these women is the extraordinary amount of energy it must have taken. Not just to do the work, though the work was hard enough, but to do it while navigating a system that was not designed for you. To find every gap, every ambiguity, every local custom or sympathetic official or inherited workshop that might give you enough ground to stand on. That is not helplessness. That is a kind of persistent structural creativity that the history books have consistently undervalued. Something else happened in the guild world that is worth knowing. As we moved into the 15th century and then the 16th, the restrictions on women did not stay the same. They got tighter. The shift is documented across England, Germany, and parts of France. As guilds grew more powerful, as trades became more specialized and more commercially significant, as the economic stakes rose, the door that had been cracked open for women began to close. Guilds that had tolerated women's participation started codifying exclusions. Regulations that had been silent on the subject of women began to speak, and what they said increasingly was not for you. In some German cities, guilds that had previously allowed wives to assist their husbands in the workshop began specifically forbidding it. A husband could not employ his own wife. The wife could not enter the workshop at all. The space that had been built on the assumption of shared labor was suddenly legally reorganized around male exclusivity. One scholar writing about this period described it in a way that has stayed with me. She compared women's economic participation to a dance in which they were never allowed to lead. They moved when given space. They retreated when the space was taken back. And the space was taken back again and again whenever the dance became profitable enough that no one wanted to share the floor. But the guild wall and the restrictions written into law, as damaging as they were not the only forces shaping women's work on the medieval street. Because while the guilds argued over who could lift cloth from a vat and how many boxes of biscuits a woman could carry, another force entirely was reshaping the entire landscape. Something that arrived in 1347 without warning, killed roughly a third of Europe's population in 3 years, and left behind a labor market so transformed that no amount of guild regulation could hold it in its old shape. The Black Death changed everything. And for women, the change it brought was complicated in ways that historians are still debating today. That story, the plague, the labor shortage, the brief window it opened, and the ways that window was shut again almost as soon as it appeared, is what we are about to examine together right now. The year was 1348, and England was dying, not slowly, not quietly, but with a speed and completeness that nobody alive had experienced before. And very few would survive to describe with any coherence the Black Death. The Great Plague that swept across Europe from the south and east arrived on the English coast sometime in the late summer of that year, probably through the port of Weymouth. Within months, it had reached London. Within a year, it had moved through virtually every town, village, and hamlet in the country. The estimates of what it did to the population vary, but they cluster around the same terrible range. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of England's people died in the first wave alone. Then the plague came back and back again. By the 1370s, England's population, which had been somewhere around 412 million before 1348, had fallen to roughly 2.5 million. Almost half the people gone. Now, in pure economic terms, and I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting this, compensated for the horror of it, a loss of that magnitude does something very specific to a labor market. It creates a shortage. The field still needed to be plowed. The wool still needed to be sheared. The bread still needed to be baked. The cloth still needed to be woven. The market stalls still needed someone behind them. All of the work that had sustained English civilization continued to demand doing. But suddenly there were half as many people to do it, which meant, and this is the economic logic that historians have been arguing about for decades, that the people who were left, the survivors, had something they had never had before: bargaining power. For ordinary laborers, male agricultural workers in particular, the effect was dramatic and relatively swift. Wages rose. Some estimates suggest that daily wages for male casual agricultural laborers in England roughly doubled between 1350 and 1450. Laborers who had previously been tied to their lord's estate at fixed minimal rates suddenly found themselves in demand, able to move, able to negotiate, able to say, "Pay me more, or I go somewhere else." This is the period that some historians have called the golden age of the English peasantry. And for men, there is real evidence that it was. But what about women? Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting and genuinely contested. The common sense argument runs like this. If labor is scarce, and if women are available to work, then surely the shortage must have created opportunities for women. Employers who had previously hired only men or who had reserved certain tasks for men would have had to look elsewhere. Women who had been stuck in the lowest paying work would have found themselves in demand for higher skilled positions. The gender barriers that kept women out of certain trades and certain wages would have softened under the pressure of necessity. This argument has a name among historians. It is called the Golden Age thesis for post-plague women, and it has genuine supporters among serious scholars. The historian P.J.P. Goldberg, writing about women in York and Yorkshire in the century after the plague, found evidence of women moving into urban work and textile production in commercial services at rates that suggested real economic independence. He argued that the plague opened a window for women that had previously been closed. Enticing argument, clean logic. And the problem is the evidence is messier than that. The complications start almost immediately after the plague itself. In 1349, while the Black Death was still killing people across England, Parliament was unable to meet, so the King's Council acted alone. The government issued the Ordinance of Labours. 2 years later, in 1351, this was elaborated into the Statute of Labours. The statute is one of the most revealing documents in English labor history. Its stated purpose was to prevent workers from demanding the higher wages that the labor shortage had made possible. Wages were to be capped at pre-plague rates. Workers were to remain where they were. Anyone without land or a fixed trade was required to take work when it was offered at the regulated rate or face punishment. And here's the phrase that matters for us tonight. The statute specifically named every man and woman of our Kingdom of England of whatever condition, whether bond or free, who is able-bodied and below the age of 60 years. Every man and woman. The law required women, all able-bodied women under 60, who lacked a trade or sufficient land to accept whatever work they were offered at, whatever wage the law permitted. On the surface, this looks like inclusion. Women are being named in the labor legislation. Women are being counted as workers. But look at what it actually meant in practice. It meant that women who had been working flexibly, picking up casual day labor when it suited them, supplementing other household work, negotiating their own terms, were now being pressed into annual service contracts at fixed wages with restricted mobility. The freedom to work casually by the day, which actually paid better, was being replaced by the legal requirement to accept annual contracts, which locked women into lower regulated rates. And research published in recent years drawing on long-wage series covering 6 centuries of English labor data found something striking. Male casual wages rose dramatically after the plague as expected. Female wages, particularly for women in annual service contracts, did not rise at nearly the same rate. One landmark study concluded bluntly that women's servants did not share the post-Black Death golden age in the way that men did. The plague created bargaining power, but the law moved faster than the labor market. And the law, as it so often did, trapped women in the lower tier. There's a court record from 1374 that I want to tell you about, because it is vivid and human in a way that the statistics are not. It concerns a woman named Alice, the wife of John Redhead of East Rendale. Alice had been contracted to serve a local employer named Robert of Bacchanal through the harvest season as the law required. The contract was at the regulated rate. The pay was low. Alice quit. She left the contracted service and went to work elsewhere where she could earn higher wages outside the regulated system. The record documents are being presented before the local court for this violation of the Statute of Labours. She had broken the law. She had left employment and sought better pay, which was exactly what the statute was designed to prevent. She is described as having worked outside the town in order to get higher wages to the harm of the said Robert and against the form of the said ordinance. I love Alice Redhead, not because she was doing something radical. She was doing something ordinary, trying to earn more money, but she was doing it in defiance of a legal structure specifically designed to prevent her from doing so. And she got caught, and she ended up in the records. And that is how we know her name 700 years later. But Alice was not the whole story, because there is a genuine and important counterargument to the pessimistic reading of the post-plague period for women. It concerns the textile industry. After the plague, English cloth production began to expand significantly. The wool trade, which had long been England's primary export industry, began shifting. Instead of exporting raw wool to be processed on the continent, English producers started making more finished cloth domestically. New towns became centers of cloth production. Salisbury, Coventry, York, Colchester, the textile towns of East Anglia. By around 1400, the cloth trade was driving a genuine economic transformation, and cloth production at many of its stages employed women. Spinning in particular was almost entirely female work, and in a cloth industry that was expanding, spinners were in demand. The historian Judith Bennett, who has spent more time than almost anyone else thinking about the relationship between gender work and the medieval economy, made an observation that has become something of a touchstone in the field. She wrote, and I am paraphrasing here, that women tended to work in low-skilled, low-paid jobs in 1300, and that this remained true in 1700. That is 400 years of the same economic position. Through plague and recovery, through economic boom and bust, through technological change and trade expansion, the specific jobs changed, the specific wages fluctuated, but the relative position women in the lower tier paid less with less security and less access to advancement persisted with consistency that she found remarkable and troubling. Now I want to ask you something. If you could send a message back in time to the people who designed the Statute of Laborers in 1351, the lords and counselors who sat around that table after half the country had died, what would you say to them? Would you point out that their decision to cap wages and press women into compulsory annual contracts would have consequences that lasted centuries? Would you try to explain the economic irrationality of using a labor shortage to further depress the wages of workers who were already the lowest paid? Would you just ask them simply whether it ever occurred to them that the women they were legislating over had opinions about it? I think about this because the Statute of Laborers is such a perfect illustration of how institutional response to a crisis can make things worse for the people who are already most vulnerable. The plague created a window of genuine possibility. The law slammed it shut, not deliberately, not specifically targeting women, but the effect was the same. The people who had the least bargaining power to begin with were the ones who lost the most when the rules were written by the people who wanted to keep wages low. But here's what I find genuinely fascinating and what I want to leave you with as we close out this chapter. Despite everything, despite the statute, despite the wage ceilings, despite Alice Redhead being hauled before the court for the crime of wanting better pay, women kept working. They kept showing up on the market streets. They kept spinning thread and baking bread and selling fish and carrying baskets. They kept finding workarounds and moving to towns and taking the casual day work when it paid better and accepting the annual contracts when security mattered more. The economic system across the entire period we have been examining consistently undervalued their work, and they consistently showed up to do it anyway, because they had to, and because in some quieter way that the records rarely capture they chose to. There is a line in the Statute of Laborers that I have been turning over in my mind since I first read it. It says that some workers in the aftermath of the plague were choosing to beg in idleness rather than work at the regulated rates. I do not think Alice Redhead begged in idleness. I think she walked down the road and found work that paid her what she was worth. And the law called that a crime. The Black Death changed the labor market for a century. But it did not change the fundamental equation, the one written into guild rules and legal statutes and wage assessments that said women's work was worth less. Where that equation came from, how it was written into the record, and why history almost erased the women who challenged it. Those are the questions we're going to keep sitting with as we move into the next part of this story. And the next part is one I have been looking forward to telling you, because it is where we finally look directly at the gap between what these women did and what the records chose to remember. The invisible ledger and the historians who finally decided to open it is exactly where we are headed next. There is a poem that survives from 15th century London called London Lickpenny. It tells the story of a man from Kent who comes to the city to seek justice and finds instead that absolutely everything cost money. He wanders through the streets, overwhelmed and slightly baffled, and the vendors do not give him a moment's peace. Hot pescods, one cried, strawberry ripe and cherry in the rice. Then another hot sheep's feet for sale on the street. I have read a lot of medieval documents, and this one is perhaps my favorite for how casually it captures what a medieval city street actually sounded like. The relentless, overlapping calls of food sellers, each one trying to claim your attention before the next seller could. And almost all of those voices, if you walk through the history, belong to women. Food on the medieval market street was not just sustenance. It was an entire economic ecosystem, and women were embedded in it at every level. From the woman who grew the cabbages to the woman who carried them to market in a basket on her head to the woman who cooked them into something ready to eat and sold it from a pot beside the road. We have spent a lot of this journey talking about the top levels of that ecosystem. The merchants, the guild members, the femmes, souls, the widows who inherited and ran significant commercial enterprises. But tonight I want to come back to the street itself, to the smell of it, to the sounds of it, to the women who worked at the most immediate, most physical, most vital layer of the medieval food trade. The women who fed the city every single day without a guild to protect them, and without a name in the official records. In a medieval city, most of the urban poor had no way to cook at home. This is a fact that I think we tend to gloss over because we imagine the Middle Ages as a time when everyone cooked on their own hearth. But in cities in the dense, packed, narrow street urban worlds of medieval London, Bristol, York, Paris, a large proportion of the population lived in tenement rooms or shared lodgings where there was no hearth, no kitchen, and no way to prepare a cooked meal. They needed someone else to cook for them. And the answer from at least the 12th century onward was the cook shop. A chronicler named William Fitz-Stephen, writing about London in the late 12th century, described a cook shop on the Thames riverside with evident approval. He explained that eatables were available there every day according to the seasoned dishes of meat, roast, and fried and boiled great and small fish. Coarser meats for the poor, more delicate for the rich. And he noted how useful this was for any Londoner who suddenly found himself with hungry visitors and nothing to serve them. He could, as Fitzstephen cheerfully suggests, just dash out to the cook shop and bring back whatever was needed. Medieval takeaway, 12th century, already fully functional. By the later medieval period, cook shops were clustered in designated streets in most major English cities. Bristol had its Cook's Row. London had multiple cookshop concentrations near the Thames and in the poorer quarters. In some cities, these clusters had their own guilds, though characteristically, as with everything in this story, the guild structure worked much better for the men who owned the larger operations than for the women who ran the smaller ones. The food on offer tells you something important about the economics of the street. Meat pies were enormously popular. Portable filling able to be eaten while walking, the medieval equivalent of a sandwich. In 1350, London passed a specific law banning bakers from charging more than a penny to people who brought their own meat to have wrapped and baked. The penny regulation is a beautiful little window into how common this practice was. You brought your meat. The baker made it into a pie, and everyone understood what a fair price looked like. Pastries, hot cakes, pancakes, wafers, hot baked apples called coldlings sold warm from baskets. Oysters cried on every corner. Roasted meat turning on spits whose smell drifted down the lane. Pottage, a thick sustaining stew sold in bowls, or carried away in whatever container you brought with you. Cherries and strawberries hawked in season. Sheep's feet, as the poem tells us, available and apparently popular. And through all of this, the women carrying baskets on their heads, which, as one later account noted, left the food disconcertingly exposed to the hazards of a city street. But that was the logistics of the work. Women calling their goods. Women negotiating prices, making change, wrapping food in cloths and leaves, working through the cold morning hours when the market opened, and through the long afternoon when the crowds thinned out and the unsold items needed to be managed before they turned. By the 16th century, the regulations on these market women had tightened to a degree that was frankly absurd. A surviving record from Barrow Market in London notes that by this period, women selling produce for baskets were not allowed to sit down at all. They had to carry their wares continuously without rest, unable to set down their loads and take a moment off their feet. Women carrying heavy baskets of fruit and vegetables through a crowded market for hours without being permitted to sit. The rule was not arbitrary cruelty. It was designed ostensibly to prevent the market from becoming congested. But the specific targeting of basket-carrying women as the source of congestion, rather than the carts and stalls that occupied far more space, tells you something about whose comfort the regulators were primarily thinking about. It is a small detail, but small details accumulate. And this one sits next to the ordinance about women in fur hoods, and the law against women selling ale after a certain age, and the rule limiting a pastry maker to one box of biscuits. And together they begin to form a picture of an official world that was perpetually, specifically, deliberately managing female presence in public commercial spaces, not eliminating it. It could not do that the city needed these women too much, but making it smaller, more constrained, more uncomfortable, more subject to oversight. And then there's the other layer of the food and care economy, the one that is even harder to see because it operated in the spaces between official records. The healers. Medieval women served as the primary healthcare providers for the vast majority of the population, particularly the poor. Not because they chose to specialize in it in the way a modern professional chooses a career, but because caring for the sick, the injured, the laboring, and the dying was understood to be structurally part of what women did. A mother who learned which herbs reduced a fever passed that knowledge to her daughter. A neighbor who knew how to set a broken bone shared that skill with the women in her village. A woman who had attended enough births to understand what was normal and what was dangerous became the person everyone came to when labor began. These were not peripheral figures. A study of medieval healthcare has suggested that women represented the overwhelming majority of actual practitioners in everyday life. The ones who were there in the room when someone was ill. The ones who prepared the remedies. The ones who sat through the night. They appear in official records as fewer than 2% of licensed practitioners in late medieval France and England. But the licensed practitioners, the formerly trained physicians with university degrees, were a small and expensive elite who served the wealthy. The woman who showed up at your door when your child was burning with fever was not licensed. She was your neighbor, and she was there. Here's a case that I find almost too stark to believe, and yet the records are clear. In Paris in the early 14th century, a woman named Jacoba Felissier was brought before the medical authorities and charged with practicing medicine without a license. The charge was not that she had harmed anyone. It was not that her treatments had failed. 6 witnesses testified on her behalf. They said she had cured them after multiple trained physicians had given up on them. One patient specifically stated that she was wiser in the art of surgery and medicine than any master physician or surgeon in Paris. That testimony was used against her, not because it was false, because the court's position was that it did not matter how skilled she was. It did not matter that the people she treated had been helped. The issue was that as a woman, she had dared to cure it all. Jacob Felicia was found guilty. I have thought about that case many times, about what it says about the relationship between competence and authority, about the way institutions can decide that the credential matters more than the outcome, about the fact that the people who benefited from her care, the sick people she had healed when the licensed physicians had failed, were not sufficient witness to her right to practice. She was good at what she did, and the law said that is not enough. Now, midwifery was a different story, and the distinction is worth spending time on. Childbirth in the medieval world was surrounded by a powerful cultural taboo about male presence. Men did not attend births. Not physicians, not husbands, not anyone male. The room where a woman gave birth was entirely, and without exception, a female space. This exclusion, which was rooted in religious ideas about the sacred privacy of the birthing chamber, had the effect of creating the one area of medieval healthcare where women had something close to a monopoly. Not because anyone was being generous, but because men had collectively decided that the topic made them uncomfortable. Midwives attended births across every social class. Some of them were compensated by their towns with tax exemptions or small pensions, a measure of formal recognition rare in this period for women's work. The most skilled and reputable midwives built reputations that spread far beyond their immediate neighborhoods. A woman named Buro de Lablier is documented in French records as serving the Queen of France as a royal midwife, called upon specifically because of her outstanding reputation, and the knowledge midwives held was genuine, hard-won, and irreplaceable. When a birth went wrong, when a baby lay in an incorrect position, when labor stalled, when bleeding became dangerous, the midwife's experience was the only resource available. There were no hospitals in the modern sense. There was no emergency medicine. There was the midwife and what she knew. But here is the part of this story that should feel familiar by now, because we have seen the pattern repeat. As the medieval period gave way to the early modern era, and as formal medical training became more organized and more formalized, the credential began to matter more than the skill. Universities trained physicians, but universities did not admit women. So women could not be credentialed. So women who had been doing the work for centuries found the law increasingly array against them. English physicians sent a petition to Parliament in the later medieval period describing women healers as worthless and presumptuous, and calling for fines and long imprisonment on any woman who attempted to use the practice of physic. They were not describing women who were incompetent. They were describing women who were, by the evidence of their patients, competent enough to compete. And competition as we have seen throughout this whole story, was the thing that triggered the response. By the 14th century, the organized medical profession had largely succeeded in pushing women out of formal medical practice. Among the upper classes, the poor still relied on the women who knew herbs and remedies in birth. But the wealthy increasingly went to the licensed men, and the women who continued to practice outside the licensed system, carrying their knowledge from house to house, working in the shadows of a regulatory environment that did not acknowledge them. They started to be called something else, something with pointed hats and cauldrons, something that the church painted on its walls as a warning. We have, I think, been here before. This is the pattern that haunts the whole of this story. Is it not a skill as necessary? Women develop it and practice it and pass it on. The skill becomes valuable enough to organize. An institution forms around it. The institution writes rules. The rules exclude women from full participation. And the women who remain the ones who keep working outside the institution, who keep showing up with their baskets, and their knowledge and their competence are described as problems, as threats, as people whose presence in the public space of the city needs to be managed, constrained, limited, moved along. The food seller cannot sit down. The healer cannot cure. The Elu wife belongs in a church mural in hell. And yet they were there, and the city needed them. And every day that something got cooked, or a sick child got better, or a woman survived labor and held her baby for the first time, some part of that was because a woman who had no guild, no license, no official recognition, and no place in the formal record had shown up and done her work. The invisibility of these women in the historical record is something that historians have been working patiently and systematically to address for the last several decades. And the story of how they finally became visible, how the scholars who started asking different questions found these women hiding in plain sight in the documents that had always been there. That is one of the most interesting stories in the history of history itself, and is exactly where we are going next. Somewhere in a records office in England, there is a roll of parchment from the 14th century. It was written by a coroner, a local official whose job was to record sudden, unnatural, and unexplained deaths. Nobody wrote these documents thinking they would be read 700 years later by historians trying to understand what ordinary medieval women did with their days. The coroner wrote them because the law required it. He wrote down the name of the deceased where they died, what they were doing when they died, and who witnessed it. And in doing so, almost accidentally, he preserved something that no chronicle and no guild record and no royal tax roll was designed to preserve. He preserved the moment. Barbara Hannawalt is an American historian who spent her career at Ohio State University, and she belongs to the generation of scholars who fundamentally changed how we think about medieval ordinary life. In the 1970s and 1980s, when most medieval history was still focused on the lives of kings, nobles, and battles, Hannawalt took a different direction. She went into the archives, not looking for the famous or the powerful, but for the unremarkable, the everyday, the people who never expected anyone to remember them. She read through approximately 20,000 criminal court records from medieval England. She went through coroner's rolls, those casualty reports of medieval daily life. She analyzed poll tax returns, memorial court rolls, wills. And from all of those documents designed to track debt, adjudicate disputes, and record the dead, she assembled something extraordinary, a portrait of ordinary medieval life that had never been drawn before, including buried in these records the lives of women. Here is what she found in the coroner's roll specifically. When someone died suddenly, and the coroner wrote it down, he noted where the person was and what they were doing. And these incidental details recorded for purely legal purposes, not for posterity, become 700 years later windows into ordinary medieval existence. A woman taking reeds to market. A woman taking cheese to market. A woman drawing water from a well. A woman going to the mill with grain. A woman in the garden. A woman on the road between two villages. These are not stories. They are inventory items in a legal document. But they tell us with a specificity that no narrative source provides where women actually were and what they were actually doing on ordinary medieval days. And what Hannawalt found as she read through these rolls was that medieval women were not primarily confined to the interior of the house. They were out. They were moving. They were working in the village, in the fields, on the roads, between settlements of the markets. The image of the medieval woman as a domestic figure, quietly spinning by the fire. That image was partly a construction of the later centuries, projecting their own ideals backward into the past. The coroner's rolls told a different story. Now I want to ask you something that I think gets at the heart of why this kind of historical work matters. Have you ever looked at a very old document, a letter, a photograph, a diary, anything, and felt the presence of the person who made it? Not the famous person, not the historical figure you were studying, but the ordinary person who was simply living their life when it was written. That is what Hannibal was doing, reaching through the documents, not for the interpretation of history, but for the people themselves, and finding them there exactly where the record said they were, on the road to market, at the well, taking cheese somewhere. But the coroner's rolls were only one kind of document. And the problem with medieval women's history is not just one archive. It is the entire architecture of the medieval record-keeping system. Almost every official document in medieval England was built around a set of assumptions that made women systematically difficult to find. Tax records classified women by marital status, maiden, wife, widow, rather than by occupation. The 1381 poll tax, for example, one of the most complete surveys of the English population from the medieval period, grouped households around the male head. A woman described as John Smith's wife had no independent identity in the document. Her occupation, if she had one, simply did not appear. Guild records listed members, but full membership, as we have seen throughout this series, was overwhelmingly male. Women who worked in guild trades often did so under their husband's name or informally, or at a level just below the threshold of documentation. Property records listed owners, but married women did not own property, so they could not appear in property records in their own right. Court records listed plaintiffs and defendants, but cover meant that a married woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. She could not sue or be sued independently in most circumstances, so she did not appear in those records either. The record-keeping system was not designed to exclude women. It was designed to record men, and women fell through the gaps a design created. The historian Judith Bennett, who has done more than almost anyone to think systematically about why women's medieval history was so hard to recover, made an observation that I find illuminating. She noted that even when we find women in the records, we tend to find them in particular circumstances. They appear when something goes wrong, when they are widowed, when they are in debt, when they violate a law, when they are brought before a court. In other words, we find them in crisis. The daily competent, unremarkable work, the ordinary labor that sustained the medieval economy generated almost no documentation because there was nothing to document. Nobody went to court over a loaf of bread that was sold without incident. Nobody wrote a legal record of a woman who successfully carried her cheese to market and came home with coin in her pocket. The routine was invisible precisely because it was routine. And this is one of the most profound challenges in writing the history of ordinary people, and especially the history of ordinary women. The more normal something was, the less likely it was to be written down. We are, in a sense, only able to see the moments when things broke down. One of the methodological breakthroughs in medieval women's history came from learning to read documents against their grain. What that phrase means for anyone unfamiliar with it is this. Instead of asking a document what it was designed to tell you, you ask what it reveals inadvertently. The sumpta law that restricted women's clothing in the marketplace was designed to reinforce class hierarchy. But read against the grain. It tells you that enough working women were prosperous enough to dress well, that the authorities felt threatened. The ordinance restricting women from selling ale at Chester in 1540 was designed to limit female commercial presence. But read against the grain. It tells you that women had been selling ale in Chester for long enough, and in enough numbers that the ordinance was considered necessary. The tax record that lists John Smith and wife was designed to document John's household. But read against the grain. It raises the question, what was the wife's contribution? What did she do all day? Who knew her by name in the market? And some of the most extraordinary breakthroughs have come from sources nobody thought to use for this purpose until recently. Wills and testaments, for example. A medieval will is a document about property. Who gets what after a person dies? It was not written as a document about relationships or occupations. But when historians began reading medieval wills with the question of women in mind, they found something remarkable. Women appearing as witnesses to wills, which means they were present, trusted, considered credible by their person writing. Women receiving specific bequests, not land, which typically went as sons but tools. A spinning wheel, a market basket, a set of brewing equipment, tools. The things a working woman used, named specifically and given to someone who was expected to use them. These bequests tell you what the woman who left the tools had been doing all her life, and they tell you what the woman who received them was expected to do. The knowledge, the skill, the work passed down not in a formal apprenticeship, but in an inheritance of equipment. Miracle stories are another source that historians have turned to in unexpected ways. Medieval churches collected accounts of miracle stories of divine intervention, healing, and impossible events that were submitted as evidence for the sanctification of particular saints. These stories were not obviously records of economic activity. They were religious testimonials, but they are told in specific, vivid detail. They name the people involved. They describe what those people were doing when the miracle happened. And what they describe often is ordinary working life. A woman who was ill and could no longer do her work. A woman who recovered and returned to the market. A woman who prayed while grinding grain, and the mill stopped, and she took it as a sign. These are snapshots of daily life, captured in a format nobody designed for that purpose. The medieval storyteller was trying to demonstrate the power of a saint. The historian, reading centuries later, finds a woman at a mill. There is something I think is worth naming explicitly because it is easy to intellectualize and hard to sit with. The invisibility of medieval women in the records was not accidental. It was structural. It was the product of a legal system that defined women as dependent rather than agents, of an economic system that measured productivity in terms of the goods and services that changed hands in formal markets, not the labor that sustained households and communities, of a cultural system that considered women's work in the home or the market stall at the bedside of the sick as a natural extension of their domestic role, rather than a productive contribution that deserved recognition. These were not neutral choices. They were choices made by people with interests in the outcome. Men who ran the guilds that wrote the membership rules. Men who sat in parliament and wrote the labor laws. Men who kept the tax records and decided what categories mattered. And the invisibility that resulted was not just a scholarly problem. It was, and in some forms remains, a political one. I want to tell you about a specific example of how the gap between documentation and reality plays out in practice. There is a category of medieval workers called spinsters, and we have discussed this word earlier in the series, how it originally simply meant a woman who spun thread in many London tax records from the medieval period. Spinster appears as an occupational designation for a very large proportion of the women listed. Historians initially took this at face value. A lot of women in medieval London were spinners, but when they looked more carefully, they noticed something odd. The women listed as spinsters in the tax records included women who in other documents appeared doing something completely different. A woman listed as a spinster in a tax assessment turns up in a court record as a seller of fish. Another appears in a will as an innkeeper. Another in a guild fine record as a brewer. What was happening? The best current interpretation is that spinster had become a kind of default occupational category for women in London's tax system. If a woman needed a trade listed and no more specific trade was recorded, she was written down as a spinner, which means that the tax records, the very documents historians rely on to understand women's work, were systematically misrepresenting what women were doing. The category existed not to describe their work, but to fill a box in a form. And when you realize that, you begin to see the scale of the eraser. Not just women being missed, but women being actively misfiled, shuffled into a single catch-all category, regardless of what they actually did with their days. Something has been happening in the last few decades, though, that I find genuinely exciting to talk about. Digital history. The systematic digitization of medieval documents, tax rolls, court records, guild registers, church accounts, memorial court rolls has made it possible for historians to do things that were previously unimaginable. To search across thousands of documents simultaneously. To identify names that appear in multiple records and trace a single person across different sources. To map where women lived and worked and died with a geographic precision that individual document reading could never achieve. Projects like the Borame Bank Research Project, which is how Annabelle Ferner, the spice merchant, whose story we told in Part 6, came back to light after 600 years of obscurity, are only possible because someone thought to digitize those banking records and make them searchable. And there are thousands of documents still sitting in county record offices, church archives, and national collections that have never been systematically read for women's history. Entire networks of female workers, traders, healers, craftswomen who exist in documents that nobody has opened with that question in mind. That work is ongoing. New names are being found every year. New stories, new evidence of the scale of women's presence in the medieval market economy. There is a phrase that the historian Caroline Barron used when writing about women in medieval London. She called it the search for the Golden Age. The idea that there was a period, perhaps the late 14th and early 15th centuries, when women in London's commercial economy had more opportunity, more legal recognition, more practical power than at almost any other point before the modern era. Some historians agree with her. Others argue the evidence is more complicated, and the debate itself is part of what makes medieval women's history so alive as a field right now, because both sides of that debate are essentially arguing about the same thing. What was actually happening on those market streets? What did those women's working lives look like at the level of the specific, the individual, the day-to-day? We cannot answer that fully. The records are not designed to tell us, but we can get closer than we used to be. And every woman who surfaces from a document, every name, every detail, every accidental piece of evidence left behind by a legal system that was not paying attention to her as a person, is a step toward a truer picture. We have spent the last 9 parts of this series assembling that picture piece by piece. The Alu wife and her broom, the huster with her basket, the silk thruster at her spindle, the femme soul in her workshop, the widow who stepped forward when her husband died, the healer who showed up when the physicians would not, the food seller standing in the market without being permitted to sit down. Each of them was real. Each of them worked. Each of them left traces, small and inadvertent, in documents that were trying to record something else entirely. And the story of how those traces are being assembled into a full picture. How the history of the medieval market street is being rewritten to include the women who were always there. That story has one more piece to it that we have not yet fully told. The piece that connects the women on those medieval streets directly to us, to the world we live in now. To the questions we are still asking about women work and who gets remembered. That is exactly where we are going in. The final parts of tonight's journey. There is a sentence written by historian Judith Bennett that I have been turning over in my mind throughout this entire series, and I want to share it with you now in part 11, because I think it is the sentence that unlocks the deepest layer of everything we have been talking about. She wrote, "Women were as clustered in low-skilled, low-status, low-paying occupations in 1200 as they were in 1900. 700 years, 2 centuries straddling the Industrial Revolution, the printing press, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the abolition of serfdom, the rise and fall of empires. And across all of that change, the relative economic position of women stayed, in its fundamental structure, the same." That is not a comfortable sentence to sit with. But I think it is one of the most important sentences in this whole series, because here is the thing. We tend to think of women's economic history as a story of gradual progress. Medieval women constrained, limited, legally invisible. Victorian women beginning to assert rights. 20th century women finally achieving equality. And so on, a straight line, if uneven, pointing upward. But what Bennett and the historians who have followed her work have found is something more complicated, and in some ways more disturbing. The specific occupations changed. The specific laws changed. The specific institutions changed. But the pattern, women in the lower tier paid less with less legal standing and less access to advancement, reproduced itself across every major economic transition. Medieval guild walls gave way to factory regulations. The cottage industry gave way to the factory floor. The market stall gave way to the retail counter. And at each transition, women found themselves again in the familiar position. Numerous in the workforce, essential to the work, consistently undervalued, underpaid, and underrepresented at the top of whatever structure had replaced the previous one. The Industrial Revolution is worth pausing on here, because it is the moment that tends to get the most attention in the history of women and work, and because it is the moment where the story from the medieval market street connects most directly to the world we can recognize. In the late 18th century, England began its transformation into an industrial economy. The wool and linen and cotton trades, which had been organized around cottage production and hand spinning and hand weaving for centuries, began to move into factories. Machines took over tasks that had been done by hand. The workplace separated from the household. For the women who had spun thread in their homes as part of the medieval household economy, work that was low paid, but that was integrated into their daily lives, done on their own schedule. The factory offered something new: wages. Regular wages paid to them directly in coin. And in the first decades of industrialization, women flooded into the textile mills. In the cotton factories of the 1830s, women and girls made up the majority of the factory labor force. They were numbers dominant. You might expect that dominance to translate into some form of power, but it did not. Because women, as in the medieval period, were clustered in the lower paid, lower skilled positions within the factory. The high-paying mule spinning work, which required the same kind of learned skill that any craft trade had required, was monopolized by men. Women operated the machines that men decided women should operate. Men set the pace and the rules. And the wages for women's factory work were consistently structurally lower than wages for equivalent men's factory work. The dance, to use Bennett's phrase, continued. Different floor, different music, same arrangement. Women never led. And this is the part that I find genuinely striking, and which I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. Something happened in the 19th century that had no real medieval equivalent: the ideology of the domestic sphere. As the Industrial Revolution reorganized work, pulling men out of the home and into factories and offices, a new cultural argument emerged to explain and justify this reorganization. The argument went something like this: men belonged in the public world of commerce and labor. Women belonged in the private world of the home. This was not a new arrangement. It was argued it was the natural order, the way things were supposed to be. Men's work was productive, serious, economically meaningful. Women's work in the home was a calling, a vocation, something above the grubby world of wages and commerce. This ideology was in historical terms a relatively recent invention, dressed up as an eternal truth, and it achieved something quite specific. It retroactively redefined the working women of history as exceptions, anomalies, deviations from the normal. The Alu wife, the huster, the silk throster, the femme soul. All of those women we have been talking about throughout this series were reframed, implicitly, as unusual. The real normal medieval woman in this 19th century reading had been at home. But we have spent 12 hours watching what actually happened on those market streets. We know that is not right. One historian, Alice Clark, who published one of the first major studies of women's work in 17th century England in 1919, made an observation that has reverberated through the field ever since. She argued that as capitalism expanded, there was more division of labor, with husbands taking paid work outside the home, while wives were reduced to unpaid household work. That the home is a unit of production which had given medieval and early modern women a form of economic relevance, however constrained, was dismantled by capitalism. And what was lost in that dismantling was not just the income. It was the economic identity. A medieval woman who brewed ale, spun thread, sold eggs at the market, and tended the herb garden was doing many different kinds of work. All of it was woven into the household economy in a way that made her contribution visible, even if underpaid and underleal. The Victorian woman who managed a household, organized the food, managed the servants, raised the children, maintained the social relationships that kept the family's position intact, was doing work that was just as real, just as skilled, just as economically necessary. But now it was called not working. One historian put it with striking clarity: the gender division of labor that had existed through the medieval period slowly became a gender definition of labor itself. Men went out to earn wages. That was labor. Women stayed home. That was not labor. It was just being a woman. Do you feel the weight of that? I keep coming back to it, because the women we have been following throughout this series, through market days and guild courts and silk workshops and brewing houses and healers' sick rooms, they were not doing what they did because they had won some kind of argument about women's rights. They were doing it because they had no choice, and because the alternative, not working, was not actually an option for any woman who needed to eat. The ideology of the idle domestic woman was always at every point in history a story told by and for the wealthy. The ale wife did not have the luxury of domesticity. The hustler with her basket of eggs could not afford to stay home and let the world come to her. And even in the Victorian era, even at the height of the woman belongs in the home ideology, working-class women continued to work in factories, in other people's houses, at street stalls that were direct descendants of the medieval market. The ideology described middle-class and upper-class women, and it dressed itself up as the truth about all women, which is one of the oldest tricks in the book. There is a continuity in this story that I want to name directly, because I think it is easy to see it and still miss what it means. The pattern women doing essential economic work being paid less for it, and being periodically told that the work they are doing is either not real work, or is somehow unsuited to their nature, is not a medieval problem that the modern world has solved. The gender pay gap exists today. The concentration of women in lower paid occupations exists today. The underrepresentation of women at the senior levels of most institutions exists today. And just as in the medieval period, there is a ready set of explanations available for each of these facts. Explanations that locate the cause in women's choices, women's preferences, women's natural tendencies. The medieval guild masters said women could not be full members because they lacked the appropriate training. The medieval law said women's wages should be lower because their labor was worth less. The medieval church mural said the alewife belonged in hell because she was a daughter of Eve. And 700 years later, we have updated versions of each of those arguments that function in almost exactly the same way. I'm not saying nothing has changed. Enormous things have changed. Women can vote. Women can own property. Women can be surgeons, guild masters, members of parliament, chief executives. The law no longer says their wages should be lower, but the pattern, the deep structural pattern of women's work being undervalued, underprotected, and underpaid relative to men's work. That is not a relic of the Middle Ages. That is a feature of the present. And this is why I think the history we have been telling for the last 12 hours matters. Not because the past is identical to the present. Not because the medieval alewife is the same as the woman working a minimum wage job in 2026, but because the history shows us the mechanism. When an industry is low status, women enter it and shape it. When it becomes profitable, the barriers to entry are raised. When the barriers exclude women, a cultural narrative develops to explain why this exclusion is natural and appropriate. And by the time the narrative is fully in place, the fact that women built the industry has been forgotten. The brewers who made ale the essential drink of medieval England built the brewing industry. The silk workers of Paris built the luxury textile industry of Northern Europe. The hewers and regratises built the urban food distribution system that fed the medieval city. And in each case, as the industry grew, became more profitable, became more organized, became more male, the women who had built it became invisible. And the invisibility was then used to argue that they had never really been there. Here is a question I have been sitting with since I started preparing this series. If we had access to the complete, unfiltered record of medieval economic life, not the guild records that excluded women, not the tax assessments that classified them by marital status, not the legal documents that subsided their identities into their husbands. If we had perfect records of everything, every transaction, every day's work, every conversation at the market stall, what percentage of the medieval economy would we find had been built on women's labor? I do not have an answer. Nobody does. The records are not complete. They were never designed to answer that question. But everything we have learned over the last 11 parts of this series suggests the answer would be much larger than the official history ever acknowledged. And that is worth sitting with. Not with anger necessarily, though anger would be a reasonable response, but with a kind of quiet recognition. The market streets of medieval England were alive with the sound of women's voices calling their goods. The workshops of Paris glowed with the light falling on women's hands at the spindle. The cellars of English houses smelled of ale that women had brewed. The sick rooms of every village in England were attended in the night by women who knew what to do. All of it essential, all of it undervalued, all of it there. We have one more part of this journey left, and in it, I want to do something I've been building towards since we started. I want to go back to that market street at dawn, the one we started with. The woman with the flour-dusted arms and the loaves. The woman with the milk buckets. The woman hanging a broom over her door. I want to stand there one more time, with everything we now know, and really look at what we see. And I want to think with you about what it means that we are only now in the 21st century really beginning to understand who those women were and what they did. That is exactly where we're going right now. We are back at the beginning. Come stand here with me for a moment. It is before sunrise on a market day in England somewhere in the early 1300s. The air is cold. The cobblestones are damp with morning dew, and the things we agreed not to describe in too much detail. The church bell has not yet rung for the first prayer of the day. And here she is, the woman with the flour-dusted arms arranging her round loaves on the trestle. The woman with the 2 heavy buckets of milk, her breath making white clouds in the dark. And across the lane, a woman reaching up to hang a broom over her doorway, quietly without ceremony, telling the world, "I have ale today. Come in." We started here 12 hours ago, and I want to end here because I think this image is the one that contains everything. We now know so much more about who these women were than we did at the beginning of tonight. We know that the woman with the loaves was probably not a full guild member. She was running her baking business at the edge of the official economy, subject to the inspectors, who would weigh her bread and fine her if it came up short. We know that the woman with the milk was probably one of the women the tax records classified as John Smith's wife. Invisible in the official documentation, essential to the actual commerce. We know that the woman with the broom was part of an industry. She had helped build one that would systematically take itself away from her the next 2 centuries. As the ale trade became commercial profitable and therefore male. And we know that all 3 of them were there every market day, without fail, without recognition, without a place in the official record, beyond the occasional fine, the occasional court appearance, the occasional mention in someone else's document as a supporting character in someone else's story. Here is what I have been sitting with throughout this entire series, and what I want to share with you in these final minutes. The historian Judith Bennett, who has spent her career thinking about these questions more carefully than almost anyone else, wrote something that I think deserves to be read slowly. She wrote, and I am paraphrasing, that medieval women's work was no paradise and no inferno either. It was in some broad respects remarkably similar to women's work today. Medieval women's work was remarkably similar to women's work today. Not identical, not in the legal details, not in the specific industries, not in the available technologies, but in the deep structure. Women clustered in the lower paying positions. Women doing essential work that was systematically undervalued. Women building industries that once they became profitable tended to reorganize themselves in ways that moved women toward the margins. Women earning across the 700 years between the medieval market street and the early 21st century somewhere between 50 and 75% of what men earn for equivalent work. 50 to 75% consistently across plague and recovery, Reformation and Revolution, industrialization and post-industrialization. The specific wage number fluctuated the relative position held. Now I want to be careful here because this kind of historical continuity can be read 2 ways. One reading is discouraging. If the pattern has persisted for 700 years, it might feel like the evidence for change is weak, like we're stuck in a loop we cannot escape. But I do not think that is the right reading. The other reading is this. The persistence of the pattern tells us something important about its nature. It is not natural. It is not biological. It is not the inevitable result of physical differences or maternal responsibilities or any of the other explanations that have been offered across the centuries. If it were natural, if there was some biological or economic necessity behind women earning less and being systematically kept from the upper tiers of commerce, then the specific mechanisms for maintaining that gap would not need to be reinvented in every generation. But they have been. Every time the old mechanisms became obsolete, new ones were created. When the guild system changed, the ideological system changed. When the ideological system changed, the legal system changed. When the legal system changed, the cultural system changed. A gap that reproduces itself through active ongoing reinvention is not natural. It is chosen, maintained, decided upon implicitly or explicitly by people with interests in the outcome. And what is chosen can be unchosen. Here's what this history gives us that I think is genuinely practically useful. It gives us a longer perspective. When we argue about the gender pay gap today, when someone says that the gap is explained by women's choices, or by women's natural preferences, or by the industries women choose to enter, we now have 700 years of evidence to check those claims against. And what the evidence shows is that those explanations tend to arrive with remarkable consistency precisely when a new form of exclusion needs a new justification. The medieval guild masters said women could not be full members because they lacked the appropriate training. The appropriate training was available only to guild members. Women could not be guild members without the training, and the training was only available to guild members. Round and round, every generation finds its own version of that circle, and the history helps us see the shape of it. There's one more thing I want to say before we close. Throughout this series, I have been telling you about women who have no names in the official record. The Alu wife with the broom, the huster with the basket, the silk thruster at her spindle. But I want one with a name. Alice Redhead, wife of John Redhead of East Ravenale, presented before the local court in 1374 for leaving contracted service to find higher wages. Elsewhere, described in the court record as having worked outside the town in order to get higher wages to the harm of the said Robert and against the form of the said ordinance. We do not know what happened to Alice after that court appearance. We do not know if she paid the fine. We do not know if she found the better paying work she was looking for. We do not know anything about her life before or after that single sentence in a court record that was not designed to tell us anything about her at all. But we know her name. We know what she did. She looked at a contract that was paying her less than she knew she was worth. She walked away from it. She went looking for something better. And 700 years later, we are still talking about her. Not because she was famous, not because she succeeded, but because she showed up in a document, however small and however incidental, and someone centuries later thought her name was worth knowing. I think this is ultimately what the history of women's work on the medieval market street comes down to. Not the grand argument about structural patterns as important as that argument is. Not the data on wages and guild memberships and legal frameworks, but the individual women, their specific, unremarkable essential days. The bread that was baked, and the ale that was brewed, and the silk that was wound, and the sick child that was tended. None of it required recognition to be real. None of it waited for a historian to acknowledge it before it mattered. It mattered when it happened in the morning on the cold cobblestones in the lamplight of a medieval market street. And it still matters now, because the work that goes unrecorded is still work. The labor that goes unacknowledged is still labor. And the people who do it, the ones whose names the documents forgot to write down, whose contributions the record keepers decided were not important enough to note, they were always there. They are still there. And remembering them, however imperfectly, however incompletely, is part of how we learn to see them. I want to thank you genuinely and deeply for spending this night with me in the lanes and stalls and workshops of the medieval world. This journey has been one of the ones I have most loved building, because it is the kind of history that changes how you see everything. The next time you walk through a farmer's market or pass a woman selling something at a street stall, or watch someone who works invisibly and persistently and without recognition, I hope you think even for a moment about the broom over the doorway, about the basket on the arm, about the hands at the spindle, about all the women whose names we will never know who made the world run, who built the economy from the ground up, who showed up every market day without fail, and who were there, who were always there. If this story moved you tonight, if you found yourself settling in a little deeper, thinking a little longer, seeing the world a little differently, please consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment below telling me which part of tonight's story stayed with you most. Was it Alice Redhead walking away from her contract? The broom over the doorway? The silk thrusters of Paris? The 900 women spinning thread in one city at the turn of the 14th century? I would genuinely love to know. And if you have a friend or someone you love who cares about history, about women, about the stories that never quite made it into the textbooks, share this with them, because these stories deserve to travel as far as they can. Thank you for being here. Sleep well. And when you wake up, there's another story waiting for you.